On May 18th, the California Democratic Council presented at the Beverly Hills High School a political history of Richard Nixon, which they called the California Connection. KPFK has excerpts of this seminar, which includes former California Governor Edmund Pat Brown, Assemblyman John Burton, chairperson of the Democratic State Committee, Stanley Sheinbaum, economist and director of the Pentagon Papers Defense Committee, former Congressman Jerry Voorhees, Don Freed, author and playwright, and Professors Peter Dale Scott and Richard Popkin. Before going to the California Connection, domestic affairs analyst and nationally syndicated commentator Charles Morgan offers his view of the theatrical production called Watergate.
In reading a book or viewing a play, the careful audience will attend not only to what is being said and done on page or stage, it will attend also to the underlying mood and tempo intended by the author. Otherwise, crises, climaxes, and conclusions may be open to misunderstanding or confusion. In our time, the works of such as Harold Pinter or Edward Albee offer themselves as example. The reviewer who rushes from the premiere of a Pinter or Albee play to hammer out a decision without meditation on the meaning of this or that word, inflection, or gesture must be gifted either with inordinate genius or inordinate chutzpah. Attention must be given to what in journalism is called the sidebar, that seemingly unimportant bit of information which illuminates the author's intent. So it is with the Watergate melodrama now unfolding before our eyes and into our ears. What is said and done is important, of course, but that which is seemingly trivial or unintentional should demand our thought and our conclusion that the Senate Select Committee and its extraordinarily able counsel Sam Dash and Fred Thompson have come up with a carefully plotted script, which willy-nilly also involves the spear carriers and those who wait in the wings. There is little or nothing of the careless in all this. Any skilled writer would admire the way in which the committee sets its theme and premise with the introduction of Robert Odle, an administrator of the committee to re-elect the president. He was brought on almost as a nonentity, a glorified file clerk, a preliminary necessity and diversion, if you will. We, as audience, had every right to expect he would strut his bookkeeper's half-hour on the stage and be gone. But he was exposed to quizzing for more than 3 hours and emerged as an embodiment of the Aristotelian trinity of time, place, and person. He introduced almost every major character we are to meet in these next months. He established the sites and scopes of their activities. As surprised as any in the audience, this stand-in, elevated to featured status, huffed and puffed, and his wins certainly weakened the structure of marked cards meant to shelter the Watergate conspirators. The committee which authored this setting of the scene could only be credited with an exquisite dramaturgic dexterity. But it was not Odle's to introduce the note of suspense so necessary to the plot. That role remained for White House lackey Bruce Carey, who brought into play the mystery man, one Roy Shepard, a delivery man with special White House clearance, who Carey said removed files from the office of convicted Watergator E. Howard Hunt. Who is this Shepard? The ghost of panic's past or a real live man? Well, we must live with this mystery for a while, as dramatically we should. Now, the script demanded and got the cops with their law and order lines about how they put the arm on the Watergate burglars. Charming, but even more charming, Jim McCord. Even as our authors had given us Robert Odle, so we now had James Yodel, and Yodel McCord did, with an intensity qualifying him for any country and western circuit. McCord is that characterization which confounds any mystery writer. How do you draw a realistic picture of a heel without making him a hero? How do you allow him to advance the plot and deepen it in favor of the good guys without putting him in shining armor? The perfervid Nixon hater, and our number is legion, will tend to make McCord a hero, but a hero he is not. To be faithful to the story, this must be kept in perspective. McCord was knowingly involved in a seamy, turgid, toxic, illegal mess. Up from the sinks and stews of the FBI and CIA ghettos, he ambled into this one with his eyes and pocketbook wide open. Caught with his pinky in the jam pot, he began to chirp his patriotism, even as disenchanted and frightened radicals did in the 40s and 50s. And even as they, he faces a dim and dismal future. For whatever value he offers to the advancement of the good guys' plot, Jim McCord remains an informer. In the words of an old Middle European saw, some men are birds for anything, whose bread they eat, his song they sing. His value to the working of the plot is unquestioned, but the unsavory aspect of this selfishly motivated character must be kept in view unless we do indeed make him our hero, a posture we may be sure that the authors did not and do not intend. On the audience level, we may consider these hearings as a morality play in the strictest sense. All the virtues and vices are here. We may well consider them, remembering that of the 7 deadly sins enumerated by Augustine, the first is pride. Look thee to the White House, angel. Our morality play is, however, sadly incomplete. The morality play demands its everyman, who is at once the hero and the object of heroism, whose good is served in the working of the plot. How sad it is that here every man may not give a damn. In the prologue, apathy starred the reactions of far too many in response to the revelations of Watergate. And in the first scene, the TV networks reported that they were deluged with calls from irate viewers protesting that their morning diet of prurience, the soap opera, had been derailed. The networks have responded. They say they may well discontinue full-scale broadcasts of the hearings. They wail that, after all, they're losing advertising revenue which was at a record high last year, the year of Watergate. This leads to a question the authors of our play probably didn't intend. Is the corruption on Pennsylvania Avenue that much worse than the corruption on 6th Avenue? The appetite of ignorance grows by the corruption it feeds upon. One hopes the ignorance of the present critics is to be shrugged off not only by the authors of that which unfolds on our stage, but by those who provide our vision of the stage, the networks. Are the dissonant howls of a few to override or cancel out the sworn obligation to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity? The networks say the majority of protesters were men and women in the upper middle age range. One wonders how that was determined through the coldly anonymous critical device of the telephone. And one is inclined to wonder if this flood of calls did not have some sort of sinister inspiration beyond the fetid wits and humors of advancing age. Is it to be said we imply a certain organization here? Indeed it is. A critical cabal is not at all unlikely. The brains that fabricated support for the mining of Haiphong Harbor could certainly fabricate such a campaign as this. And it is not to be overlooked that one of those of advancing age who could not be bothered with such televised trivia as the Watergate's hearings was our own numero uno, Richard Nixon. The son of Peyton Place caused it to be known he couldn't be bothered. He has other things on his mind. The bombing of Cambodia, the assurance of constantly rising profits and constantly diminishing value of the consumer dollar, and attention to the game of musical chairs he plays in the name of reworking his staff with the same old, tired personnel, changing the shadow but not the substance. This man, who would assert himself as number one critic with his inattention to the play, remains the drama's most probable villain. The authors of this thing have had that in mind, and we as audience and critics must keep it there. For we are everyman, and the play must serve our purpose. Our eyes and minds must be riveted not only on stage center, but on the peripheries of the stage where the author's meaning may be more clearly elaborated or subverted. Of some poetic significance, probably, was the NBC observation that the greatest number of calls it received had to do with the preemption of a thing called Days of Our Lives. It is an irony of this troubled time that the truth of the days of our lives is being informed in the drama of the Watergate hearings, and that those who provide the view of its stage are considering denial of it. With such denial, they would make of the American tragedy an American farce which carries the seeds of our unknowing undoing. Pray that it not be said that this work before us be sidetracked, left cold and inert like Shakespeare's mackerel, only to stink and shine in the moonlight. This is Charles Morgan.
And now to the California Connection with moderator Stanley Sheinbaum. This program was produced by Stephen Blum.
There are two interesting coincidences for me here tonight. One is that a year ago today, the Ellsberg-Russo defense team gathered in California and set up offices downtown after a previous year where we were spread out around the country. And this, in our group, is a dramatic day, and we're all rather conscious of it. The second coincidence, and of some drama for me, is that in this auditorium, the ACLU held the first fundraiser for the Ellsberg-Russo defense, also just a few days later, slightly less than a year ago, and we were always grateful for that because it gave us a good kickoff. Now, I don't want to take time making many remarks. I will make the simplest one I can think of, and that is that we, the people, are finally on the aggressive. And for the first time, I find the term aggressive a pleasant one. There has been too much aggression in many ways in this country, and the people who are primarily responsible are clearly on the defensive, and I hope we keep them that way, and in essence, that is one of the purposes of this meeting tonight. One of my tasks tonight is to introduce a lot of people. I take a certain pleasure in introducing former Governor Pat Brown for a number of reasons. He and I have had our differences in the past. Almost every time I see him, he points them out to me. I want to say, though, Wally had mentioned that I was instrumental in obtaining the release of Andreas Papandreou from jail in Greece. Pat Brown played a significant role in that, and I think he ought to get credit for that. I don't think there's anything I can tell you about him that you don't already know, so I will therefore introduce Pat Brown.
Thank you very, very much. It's good to be back, and when I hear that applause, I feel another campaign coming on. But I don't want to, and I don't think that we should either, labor this Watergate situation too much. Because I don't think it's necessary, number one, and number two, because I think it's unfair. The case is now in the hands of the grand juries in New York and Washington and Florida, and I think we ought to leave it there. I think we ought to let them determine it. We then have it in the Congress of the United States and the Senate of the United States, and I'm sure that we can presume that those people are honest. And the only thing that we can... You mean that the United States senators are not honest? I mean... Well, I mean, we can't get into an argument about that when we have a case like we have. But let me just say that I think that we're going to have a fair determination, and as a district attorney, a former district attorney, and an attorney general and governor, I think that it's only fair to leave it in the hands of the authorities. Now, I don't mean that we shouldn't discuss it. I think these things here tonight, a town meeting is important, but I think we have to discuss it objectively, and we have to discuss it factually and without emotion. And pray to God that in the end our country's right and that we survived this crisis like we've survived all the others. Now let me say about the 1962 campaign. But before I say that, let me just tell you a story. A week before the campaign was over with, Richard Nixon had a press conference. And in that press conference, he said, on Friday night, I'm going to have a statewide television program, and he said, I'm going to expose Governor Edmund G. Pat Brown. He didn't say what he was going to expose, and I wasn't quite sure what he knew between you and me. I was really deeply concerned about what he was going to expose. So I waited. You know, when you're campaigning all over the state of California. You're in Eureka, you're in San Francisco, you're in Los Angeles, you're in Riverside. You wake up the next morning, you don't know where you are. So he made that statement on Monday, and the television program was to be on Friday night. Wednesday night, I was down in Riverside. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I awakened, and I looked over in the bed next to me. There was a woman. I said, that Nixon, he's framing me. And I turned on the light. It was my wife. She had joined me, and I forgot about it. Now, the point of the story is that in politics, you have to be deeply suspicious of the opposition. And in addition to that, you have to be very careful. But in the '62 campaign, I'm not going to come here and tell you that Mr. Nixon was guilty of bad campaign tactics, or that I was a paragon of virtue in that campaign. It was a tough campaign. He started out 23 or 24 points ahead of me, but we began to gain on him. In fair debate throughout this state, we debated up and down the state of California before the Associated Press, the United Press International, various places throughout this state. And I thought, and I'll be very frank with you, that I thought it was a fair campaign, and I thought we won it on the issues, because I thought the Democratic Party, the second Democratic administration in 60 years in this state, had done a good job, and that's why we won it. And why they had to resort to a phony poll 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the end of the campaign, I cannot understand. As a matter of fact, it hurt them more than it helped them. And they had this organization, I have the papers here in my pocket, or before me, the Democratic State Central Committee versus the Committee for the Preservation of the Democratic Party in California, and an unincorporated association. And in that judgment, they found that Richard Nixon had financed, and his campaign organization had financed this phony poll, this fraudulent statement of who was behind it, in the last 3 weeks of the campaign. And they found, and this is a finding of a Republican judge in San Francisco, Republican by registration before he became a judge. And the finding was it was drafted in the form of a postcard poll, was reviewed, amended, and finally approved by Mr. Nixon personally in the form attached as Exhibit A. And then they attached the poll to it. So I'm not going to talk about the '62 campaign other than to tell you that I thought it was a great campaign. I can't think of anything I enjoyed more in my life than winning it. I can't think of any campaign where I did better, and I'm not going to berate the man that I defeated, even though he's in serious trouble tonight. I'll let the others take care of that. I think the country has proven itself by the way that they've ascertained the facts. But I think it's a tragedy that a great political party felt that it had to resort to the things that it did to defeat my candidate, George McGovern, last year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. In 1974, this state is going to re-elect a Democratic senator. We are going to replace a Republican governor. And the man who is probably most key in achieving all this is John Burton. who, as you know, is chairman of the Democratic State Central Committee, Assemblyman John Burton, chairman of the Assembly Rules Committee, and an old friend of mine. We have been through much in the political process together. I am amazed that he continues to be reelected, so I have some confidence that he's going to do something very effective about the Democratic Party in 1974.
I kind of agree with Pat Brown on the subject matter of Nixon, of Watergate, and of the other things. I like to consider in my own way that I'm somewhat consistent, and consistency means, if it means amnesty for young people that went to Canada, it may or may not mean amnesty for the President of the United States, but I don't think that I would say no amnesty for no one, because I believe in forgiveness and reconciliation, and amnesty something like amnesia, and I'm very forgetful anyway. Secondly, I'm not sure that I disagree with the statements of Prince Sihanouk, where he said a weakened Nixon, who will be ineffectual in dealings with the Congress, may not be a better thing for the world than his replacement, who could be Spiro Agnew, or it could be a Democrat, James Eastland. All right, so I mean, let's keep it all in perspective. On the other hand, as Governor Brown said, if it is proven or if there is reasonable cause to believe that an individual has broken the law, committed some high crime or misdemeanor, it is up to the House of Representatives to make that accusation, and it's up to the Senate to try it, and that's kind of where I am. I would say that the thing that hit me most in this state concerning Watergate was the reaction and statement of our good, great, glorious governor, Sir Ronald, who said he didn't really consider the illegal acts committed by these fine people in the White House as making them criminals. But if you're a welfare recipient and you take another $10, that's welfare fraud, that's crime, you should go to jail. Like that was an indication of his sense of selective justice, that only the poor and the young and the non-white can break the law, and if you're white and you're middle class and you're proper Republican, you don't break the law. You may commit an illegal act, but certainly you don't break the law. And so again, as we concern ourselves with Watergate, as I am, and I'm not concerned myself really so much with the bugging and the political espionage, because that had to be idiotic. It just had to be idiotic up front. It's immoral up front to have the type of political system we have in this country that permits that type of thing to be financed. But more importantly, the cover-up in the lies are what disturb me. It's the classic case, and I'm sure when all of us were young, we fibbed to our mother, and she asked a question, and we answered the question. We got in deeper and deeper and deeper. And this is the classic case where the lie got the people in deeper and deeper and deeper. And it really boils down to the credibility of the institutions of government, because certainly it was only Richard Nixon, or it was the Republican president and the committee to re-elect a Republican president, but it does bother me about the institutions of office, and I am conservative enough and believe enough in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, again, to give any individual, whether he's the black down in South Central Los Angeles, or a Chicano in the East Side, or a WASP in Washington, D.C., the benefit of the doubt under our Constitution and the due process safeguards guaranteed to our Constitution. Because I'm one of those that believe when you infringe upon the civil liberties and the constitutional rights of one individual, you infringe upon the constitutional rights of all individuals. And I've always believed that. And I think it would be very inconsistent for those of us that raised that cry in the days of the loyalty oath, in the days of the free speech movement, and in the days of the witch hunts, to forget about it now because they're the other guys and they're the bad guys. Again, the ultimate solution to things like Watergate, to things like honesty and integrity in government, in my opinion, is to elect people of honor and people of integrity to government. It's really that simple. We are the only ones that can do it. There's no one else can do it but the people. And you want to know something? If the people would have been with it, if we would have done our job, if all of the decent thinking people would have done the right thing and would have looked at the man McGovern, would have looked at the man Nixon, and voted for the person who clearly stood out on the basis of honor and integrity, with all of the bugs, with all of the bribes, with all of the cash, with all of the suitcases, they would not have been able to win that election. It is that simple, and we cannot delude ourselves. I think it was a Republican Senator Weicker who said these people were trying to steal the very thing that was America. Well, that is true. But you want to know something? We are the ones, again, despite their illegal acts, by not doing more, by not really getting into it, that allowed them to be successful, because otherwise it would have been an attempted theft rather than a theft.
Thank you, John. I want to make a few remarks about Watergate, about Richard Nixon, about the Pentagon Papers, about what has happened to this country in the last 25 years. We got caught up in the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine, the increasing struggles about communism, stopping them anywhere, and as we know, we wound up in a disaster in Vietnam. But what happened in this country in these 25 years, and what Watergate, the Pentagon Papers are all about, it's really summarized in the one phrase, the abuse of power. This country has become, and it's no secret, very powerful, economically, even morally, certainly politically around the world. It is not as powerful in any of those senses as it was, say, 2 or 3 years ago. The point is that we became, the people in power, and the American people also, because we all share the guilt in this country of what has gone on. We like power. People have a basic instinct for power. But as soon as you start getting involved in it, you will overstate it, you will overuse it, and you will abuse it. This country cannot go around the world, as we have done, trying to tell other people how to live. This is what we have tried in Western Europe, and they are now saying nay to us because of our lost prestige, because of our weakened dollar, which was expended on frivolous gestures in other parts of the world. We tried to tell the Vietnamese how to live, what kind of a system they had. But the worst of it is what has happened in this country, and we see the abuse all the way around. It is now front pages. It's simple now. We saw before this broke out into the Watergate. Someone recently said Weathergate. We saw a Kleindienst tell a congressional committee, if you don't like what the president's doing, even if it's, he didn't say these words, but he implied them, even if it is illegal, impeach him. We know the cynicism that lay behind those words. And getting rid of a Kleindienst, and getting rid of a Kalmbach, and an Ehrlichman, and even a Nixon, is not going to do the trick. There is a lot of power at stake in this country, and it comes in many forms. We know what Vesco is all about. He tried to put $200,000 into the Republican committee so the SEC would stay off his back. What is not given equal attention is what really was at stake there. Not $200,000, but $224 million that he had skimmed off from the investors in mutual funds. That is one kind of power that is available to be grabbed for and leads to the corruption that we understand and see in this country now. Now, I suggest to you that these abuses of power will continue politically, in the political realm, in the international realm, and in the economic realm, as long as the defense budget remains as large as it is. With all the pressure that Nixon is under, there is still no move to cut the defense budget. It is still close to 1/10 of our gross national product. And that means that there are a lot of people around this country in the corporate world who stay up all night figuring out a way of getting in on that act. And with those sums involved, the abuses of power will continue. And we might get rid of a Nixon, but that defense budget will still be there as a magnet for anyone with any sense toward power, and sadly, most people have that sense, and when they get close to it, they start using it. This is what the Pentagon Papers was all about. It's what Watergate is all about, and it is the major threat to this country today, and remains so despite the titillation we are all getting from the hearings in the Senate, what have you. One of the things that comes through loud and clear in the congressional behavior today, despite all their having been offended by the Kleindienst statement to the Congress about Nixon and what the Congress can go do with itself, many of those congressmen and senators still owe their jobs to the kinds of defense contracts that can be brought into their districts and into their state. And those contracts are handed out by the executive branch. And you do what you want about the Nixon. You will not do what you want about the country until we get off this false idol of defense expenditures, and what it can do for the economy of this country. One last word as an economist. One of the major problems in this country today is the fact that income is not distributed well. We live in an affluent community here. We are meeting tonight in one of the wealthiest communities, Beverly Hills, in this country. And even if you happen to have come across the line from Santa Monica or West Hollywood, you are still living in a community that is basically in the upper 5% of the income grouping in this country. Until the incomes in this country are distributed in a way that the people can order the goods, instead of the executive branch being able to, you will have the defense budget on us. You will have the kinds of corruptions that we witnessed in Vietnam, that we witnessed in Watergate. It will not stop. This country has to get back to its first principles. The power, the pockets of power, have to be broken up. They are abnormal and they are false. And the heart of the problem lies in the Pentagon and in the White House. But no matter what else you think of, the defense budget has to go. Do not be too overjoyed, even though I said we were on the aggressive earlier. We are no ways near there.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stand in front of you right now for just about 2 minutes. I've been given the singular honor and really a great pleasure, a kind of one of a lifetime type of thing, to introduce the next speaker to you. And in trying to determine how to make this introduction, it all of a sudden occurred to me that maybe I ought to let him introduce himself in his own words. And if you will bear with me, it'll take me about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes to read this introduction. This is the preface of a book, and this preface is dated June 1972, Claremont, California. And please remember that date, June of 1972. And the preface reads as follows. The author of this book was the first victim of the Nixon-Chotiner formula for political success. It may therefore be thought that sour grapes have prompted its being written, but such is not the case. The first shock on election night was hard to take. It meant that 10 years of earnest effort and record generally judged at least good were of less consequence in deciding the outcome of an election than some cleverly turned phrases. But as events developed, my defeat was, from a purely personal point of view, almost a blessing. It gave me 3 months of unharried time to finish writing my book, Confessions of a Congressman. And at the end of that short period of unemployment, I was selected for the very job I had most wanted. The job was that of Executive Director of the Cooperative League of the United States of America. It gave me an opportunity to work at building grassroots economic and social organizations and enterprises, a satisfying and rewarding task. As time passed, I came to feel that perhaps Mr. Nixon and Mr. Chotiner had done me a personal favor in 1946. For a period of 22 years, I observed a self-imposed rule not to make any public reference to Richard Nixon. But when, in 1968, he was elected President of the United States, I could no longer in good conscience remain silent. I remember a comment made in 1954 by the Sacramento Bee on a speech of Mr. Nixon's. Quote, "There was little policy and no principle in Nixon's words, but there was displayed infinite adaptability and caution, qualities which may carry the young man far if all there is to American politics is smart jockeying for power and preferment." I hoped then, as I still hope, that the Bee was not prophetic in its observation. But as time passed, as Mr. Nixon's tactics did not change, as he advanced to the presidency by the use of those very tactics, and as I observed the devious and often dangerous practices of his administration, my hope turned to fear that the Bee may have been right in its somber prediction. So I decided to write this book and to dedicate it to the proposition that American politics can be rescued from the low state to which it has fallen in the Nixon years. Looking across this land and beyond it, I am concerned that the crisis in man's long history is upon us, now, today. I see a deterioration in the quality of our country's life that is frightening indeed. I believe I know the reason why this is so. General Omar Bradley, one of our country's finest soldiers, stated it better than I can do when he said, "We have grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. The world has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. We know more about war than we know about peace, more about killing than we know about living. It is time we began to do individually and as a nation what is right, simply because it is right, and leave the issue to a greater power than this world contains. But that, I fear, we shall not do without clear, good moral leadership and inspiration from a president of our country. Such leadership is not forthcoming now, nor will it be until another than the present occupant sits behind the White House desk. And I complete my introduction by reading this short statement from Senator Paul H. Douglas, quote, "I have seen the eyes of hardened politicians moisten at the name of Jerry Voorhees' name, and I believe he is truly one of the saints of the earth." Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Jerry Voorhees.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gordon, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I do appreciate Mr. Gordon's reading the introduction to my book. As a matter of fact, I was going to use the last two paragraphs for the conclusion of my speech, so now I don't have to do that. I might have come here this evening with a certain feeling of relief. I do have that feeling of relief. But if anybody thinks I come here tonight with a feeling of "I told you so" or satisfaction or something like that, she or he is quite mistaken, because I come with a heavy heart indeed. There are others to follow me, and I will have to be careful not to talk too long. Let me tell you why I come with a heavy heart. First, because had it not been for the dogged determination of the reporters on principally three great newspapers in this country, the Washington Post, New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times, the people of this country would tonight still be accepting Mr. Nixon's statement that nobody now or previously employed in the White House had anything to do with the Watergate caper. The tragedy of the situation was that this nation accepted Watergate as a caper for months and months and months. And I hope by this time that all those people who have gone around saying, well, it's the press's own fault that the administration tries to destroy it, have come to the realization that the very freedom of this country depends upon the freedom of that press, the immunity of reporters from being put in jail because they won't reveal confidences, and the right of free American citizens to criticize an administration in power in Washington when they believe it's wrong and not be accused of treason. The second reason I come with a heavy heart is because I let Mr. Nixon get his start. I didn't do it because I wanted to. I tried my best. It wasn't good enough. I'm not going to discuss that campaign, except I'll give you just one little insight into it. Advertisements were run saying that Jerry Voorhees' voting record is more socialistic and communistic than it is democratic. They talked about 27 votes that I had cast, which were really 17 because they duplicated a couple of lists. And without telling what these votes were, that they were very bad votes from some point of view. Well, they were votes for the Soil Conservation Act and for the TVA and for the Social Security Act, for reciprocal trade agreements, for putting a ceiling on the cost of housing for veterans, etc., etc. They were votes for things that were passing the Congress by substantial majorities. They were votes for things that were important to the people. That 46 election is of no importance whatsoever today, except for one simple reason. I don't know whether Mr. Nixon knew about Watergate ahead of time. I don't know whether he knew about the forging of a letter on Senator Muskie's stationery that accused two of his rival candidates for the Democratic nomination of sexual irregularities. I don't know how much Mr. Nixon knew about the planting of people in people's organizations who were supposed to help cause riots. I don't know how much he knew about it. What I do know is that the whole career of Mr. Nixon was based upon the very kind of tactics that his devoted staff in the White House has carried out with or without his knowledge in recent days. And I tell you that the pattern of that program, and it isn't just the break-in at Watergate, it's a whole pattern of sabotage, underhand dealings, spending of money to have fake telegrams sent to the White House from the White House expressing support for the bombing of North Vietnam and the mining of the harbor. This whole pattern of cynical contempt for the American electorate is entirely in keeping. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, and this is the pity of it. After all, when one says that anything should be done in order to win, and when on many sides you find that philosophy applauded, when you take the position that there are no ground rules of decency, you're striking at the heart of any free people in any democratic government. The schemes that were carried out by the committee to re-elect the president, and for Mr. Nixon's benefit, whether or not with his knowledge, those schemes were aimed at nothing less than the destruction of all opposition to the Nixon administration, and indeed the destruction of the Democratic Party itself if they could get away with it. Many of us almost let them. We were afraid of McGovern, one of the decentest, most profoundly religious individuals that ever was a candidate for president in the United States. Why people were afraid of him, I have no idea. Their fear should have been turned in quite a different direction. I come with a heavy heart also because in these days a stiffening of opposition to the program of the Nixon administration to subvert the American form of government and turn it into a virtual presidential dictatorship. The resentment and concern of the people about that was only aroused because a couple of wide-awake Washington cops happened to catch 5 guys burglarizing and attempting to bug the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. It's sort of poetic justice that the Washington police force was involved in this, because that's the same police force which Mr. Nixon applauded for its mass arrest of 13,000 people who were only bystanders when a bunch of kids tried to hold up traffic, and not a single one of which was convicted even of a misdemeanor, having been held in incarceration over 36 hours. Well, that's an aside. What ought to have happened in this nation is that as Mr. Nixon concentrated decision-making power in a little coterie of White House people, immune to congressional inquiry, as he took the government into his own hands and out of the hands of the duly constitutionally constituted Congress of this country, then's when people should have been aroused. They should have been aroused when a man who talks about the work ethic vetoed every single significant bill that Congress passed that would have enabled people to go back to work. The worst of which was the bill for establishing child care centers so their mothers would have a place to leave their children in safety while they could go to work. And now, by executive order, without a shred of constitutional right to do it, Mr. Nixon declares that the child care centers, even that we did have, shall be abolished in order to save money so that he can have it for this Pentagon budget that Mr. Sheinbaum was talking about. This is when the country should have been aroused. It should have been aroused when they saw the impoundment of billions of dollars on the part of Mr. Nixon and contrary to the Constitution and depriving Congress of its legislative powers. They should have been aroused when they found him invading Cambodia without a shred of congressional right to do it. They should have been aroused when, for reasons that I don't understand, the so-called peace at hand, which Dr. Kissinger had presumably arranged, never went into effect. And instead of that, the war went on with renewed fury for weeks and months until we got what? An agreement almost exactly like the one that Dr. Kissinger had presented in October. Well, I must quit. But what I'm trying to say is, I'm relieved that at last the American people seem to be waking up to the real purposes of this administration. But it's a little late, and we're doing it for reasons that are important as they can be, but to my mind aren't quite as important as the ones I've been talking about. How much do we care about people? Actually, we're in danger of having this country fall into the control of people who can buy elections, people who control our economy through monopolies almost completely, people whose boots are licked by lots of people that don't have too much. It's time that we began to do right in this country just because it is right. It's time for Democrats to realize that they have got to win the election in '74 and they've got to win the election in '76, not for the Democratic Party, but for the future of the United States. I believe we can. We didn't really lose the election in 1972. The Democratic Party won it. Our presidential candidate was defeated. But Mr. Nixon's mandate, which he interprets to mean that he can do anything he pleases, apparently, at least it did up until recent days. That mandate rests, do you know, on how many votes? On the votes of just 1/3 of the American people. For only 55% of the people voted. Mr. Nixon got 60% of that 55%, and if you'll multiply it with me, that's 33%. The other 67% either voted for McGovern or for John Schmitz or didn't vote at all. This isn't any great mandate. It certainly isn't a mandate to take from Congress its legislative powers, to veto and impound and repeal the laws of Congress that are of social value to the American people, one after another. And then to declare that if Congress dares to pass a law over a veto, he'll just impound the money anyway. This is executive dictatorship, and if it were in the hands of an administration whose skirts were completely clean of scandal could be bad enough. As it is, it's one of the tragedies of American history, perhaps the greatest tragedy this country has faced. We've got to get through it as best we can, and we can, provided the character of the American people and their compassion for those who need their help and their real search for world peace and their giving up the idea that might makes right in the world can stand up and be counted, so that the soul of this great country will assert itself again and rise above the muck and filth that some ambitious, shielded, secret fellows in the White House coterie have foisted on this nation, with or without, I do not know, the knowledge of a man who's supposed to be a responsible president of the United States.
I now want to introduce a man who will bring us to what we have come to call the California connection in the drug that is Richard Nixon. Some of you will know Don Freed. He's been very active in this community for a long time. I have been terribly impressed with him for a long time. He is an activist, a teacher. He's a teacher of English, of humanities at the Otis Art Institute. He has published many books. I want to mention just 3 of them. One are the Glass House Tapes, which is an interesting metaphor here, but we won't go into it. Another is The Agony in New Haven. And one that is coming out tomorrow and will be on the book stands is Executive Action, the Assassination of a Head of State. Also, about 2 years ago, some of you may have seen it down at the Music Center in the Mark Taper Forum, a play by Don Freed. The U.S. versus, the name of the play was Inquest, and it was about the case of the U.S. versus Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, which, again, was a manifestation of the same apparatus that brings us here tonight. He is the recipient of many awards, and I am very glad to introduce Don Freed.
Thank you. It's good to be back in Beverly Hills with old friends, where we sorted out many issues of the 1960s. And now the great acts of Operation Gemstone, which was the formal title of the Watergate affair, of which that is only a corner, swings like an enormous thresher back and forth, and if some blood is let, we can only stand here to try to give some coherence to the chaos in which we find ourselves. There's the tip of the iceberg, and that's the Watergate burglary and the burglary of the Ellsberg psychiatric office. And then there's the huge, immobile as yet, and frozen iceberg. Now tonight, in just a few moments, we can only talk a little bit about the tip of the iceberg and about the iceberg. But I have 2 guests here who are sort of guest consultants to the Citizens Research and Investigating Committee and a new book we're working on called Operation Gemstone. And they, of all people I know, can open a window at least, or cast a light, or produce an angle of refraction towards that frozen monolithic iceberg which had been bearing down on us so fast and so hard until recent events called our attention to our own peril. And the steps in self-defense that we will take now, not out of question of morality, not out of question of guilt or evil, and not out of a question of sending somebody to jail. We certainly would like amnesty for everyone. We're not after a non-entity like Richard Nixon, though impeaching him may very well be the first step in a purgation of the American body politic. We're after much more. So I'm going to introduce our guests, and they're going to talk a little bit about the iceberg. And then I'm going to bring on some charts and talk about the tip of the iceberg. And then those who still have questions, and they will be many, I will mention a date in the future when we will have a lot more time than this to discuss at great length this iceberg and its tip. But I would like to remind you that not only is this not a caper, but it is also not only a small coterie of men in the White House. We are talking so far about 12 agencies of government infiltrated and overtaken with Nixon agents and those powers which Nixon represents. And I'm referring to Justice, the Interior, Defense, Commerce, Transportation, that was Eagle Crow, the National Security Council, Henry Kissinger himself, who by no means is above this battle, and who called on his long experience in Army intelligence to work first hiding in Pakistan before he flew to China, and he received kudos for that bit of espionage and that bit of clandestine activity, but he's not to receive kudos for the fact that he spied on his own trusted associates, that he connived and spied and tried to stand aloof from this. He will be dragged down yet in this scandal. We go on to the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency. The situation is so horrible that were it happening in another country, you would be studying the papers every morning to see from what direction the coup was coming. There is the White House staff, of course, and the Securities Exchange Commission. We have so far over 36 individuals at the highest level either indicted or cashiered or resigned, and a flood of indictments yet to come, and men to go to prison, and others who will never be, who should go to prison and never will. That's the tip of the iceberg. And there was an East Coast conspiracy and a West Coast conspiracy, and over 100 operatives in the field, and $15 million at a conservative estimate, and that is not a budget for bugging an office or burglarizing a psychiatric suite. That is a budget for a coup de main, and we will talk about that when we finish introducing and discussing some of the glimpses and parameters of the iceberg. The first speaker is Peter Dale Scott. And Dr. Scott is a professor of English at the University of California at Berkeley. He's also a political scientist, and he was in the Canadian Diplomatic Corps before that. He did not put on his notes to me, but I know that he is a translator of poetry of great sensitivity. And although in recent years he has come to be known for something beyond poetry and literature, his book, The War Conspiracy, and his book, The Politics of Escalation, are two of the most important books of the last decade, irreplaceable footnotes to the outrage of Southeast Asia. His essay in the Pentagon Papers, from a special point of view, is necessary reading. He's been published in the New York Review of Books, in Ramparts Magazine, and in The Nation, and he is the source for many researchers and writers who are also well known to you. He is the researcher's researcher. He is a kind of gray eminence of the movement that is starting to bring some lucidity, I hope, in the 70s to the passion that we generated in the 60s. Professor Peter Dale Scott.
I'd like to begin with what I think was a rather strangely prophetic quotation from a law enforcement man in the federal government who said a few years back, he said, "Organized crime will put a man in the White House someday, and he won't even know until they send him the bill." Now, with what we've seen happen to America since World War II, and in a sense, I'm afraid, since World War I, it is, after all, the function of government to mediate between the real powers in society, and when organized crime becomes a real power in society, and it is a real power in society today, then all governors must, in one way or another, deal with the phenomenon of organized crime. That is not what I'm going to talk about tonight. There are other men in government who have received funny contributions from illicit sources. There were some of those even in the McGovern campaign when Nixon was trying to shoot down some of the other Democratic candidates. That is not something to attack a man for, and that is not what I'm going to attack Mr. Nixon for, even though we have had men like Mickey Cohen or Louis Kung of the China lobby and people like that admitting that they've put money into Nixon's campaign funds from time to time in the past. There are certain things to be explained. And one is, why is it at this time of crisis for the nation, when Nixon is now almost alone, he's lost his whole White House staff, he's lost some of the strongest men in his cabinet, he appears in public with Ziegler, who used to be a tour guide at Disneyland, who does he spend his time with these days? He retires to secret places. He goes to the Bahamas. We all know who he's spending his time with. He's spending his time with Bibi Rebozo. So I will begin, and I don't know if that's just a joke, frankly. I don't think it is. I'd like to say a few words about Bibi Rebozo, whom Nixon first met, nobody knows for sure when, either 1948 or 1950 or 1951, apparently because Nixon is a good gambler, and as a gambler has always been at home down in Miami and was very much at home down there back in 1948 and 49 and 50, where, and as you remember, it was the first place that had to be investigated by Senator Kefauver and his touring committee because the hotels and restaurants and cafes had been so infiltrated by organized crime. Now, Bibi Rebozo made his first money during the war recapping tires, and he's never had to go to court for it, although it is now established that he got into the tire recapping business by a loan from somebody who was in the local OPA tire board, and that was clearly a conflict of interest. Nobody's ever had to answer for it. One of Rebozo's early and intimate business associates down there in Miami is a man who did go to court and was convicted for black market activities in World War II. I only mention his name, Walter Friedrich, because Rebozo and Friedrich have since gone into at least one business deal together with Richard Nixon. In the 1960s, Bibi Rebozo makes a friend with somebody in the Small Business Administration. And there again is a clear conflict of interest here when Rebozo starts getting loans from the Small Business Administration and cutting in the local administrator on some of his land deals, which again involve Richard Nixon. I want to mention one of those in particular. He gets a loan from the Small Business Administration to build a shopping center for exile Cubans in Miami. And the man he puts in there is a former mayor of Havana in the Batista era, who in 1968 ends up heading up a committee called, you've guessed it, Cubans for Nixon. What's interesting about this deal is the man that Rebozo chose for his contractor to build the center. He chose Big Al Polizzi, who also appeared before the Kefauver Committee. And although it's true that Mr. Polizzi hasn't been in jail since Prohibition, it is also true that the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was very interested in this man in the 1960s. As they told a congressional committee, he's seen in the company of top international narcotics traffickers. And they handed a memo to a congressional committee about Big Al Polizzi, in which I will quote, "He is one of the most influential members of the underworld in the United States." Now, the response of the Rebozo people to the bad publicity about this when they came out was to say, oh, he gave us a low bid. But that's not the whole story, because researchers have found many documents in which Bibi Rebozo had been signing papers to help Big Al Polizzi, and at least one document in which Big Al Polizzi was signing a petition to help out Bibi Rebozo. I want to say a little bit also about a stolen stock deal in 1968. The stock ended up in Bibi Rebozo's bank in Key Biscayne. The stock had come from one of the top syndicate fences on the East Coast. The go-between in the deal was one of the principal figures in the Bobby Baker scandals in 1964, who had helped Bibi Rebozo get started in an earlier era when Bibi didn't have much money. Well, the stock was clearly stolen. And the insurance company sent out a circular to all the banks in the country saying, watch out for this stolen stock because we've just learned it's been stolen. After that circular went out, Bibi Rebozo's bank sold the stolen stock, so they didn't run into any trouble. They've now since been sued by the insurance companies, you might guess. Bibi Rebozo says, well, we checked out that stock. We phoned two people. One was James Crosby, the head of Resorts International that runs a big casino in the Bahamas that everybody says is Meyer Lansky's casino. Why would you phone a man like that about some stolen stock, I wonder? Who was the other person? He phoned two people about that stock. He made a call out to the West Coast, to Don Nixon, The brother of the president, the man who figured in the Hughes loan back in 1958. This is the man whom Nixon sees today, and more importantly, and I wouldn't have mentioned any of this if it weren't for the fact that he's also the man who has helped Nixon make his shrewd investments in Florida real estate for at least the last 12 years. And I'd like to mention just two of those deals that we know about. One was the Fisher Island deal in Miami Harbor. This was a political speculation. People had bought land on this island in the hope that they could get the Miami City Council to build a causeway out to the island, which obviously, if they did, would drive the land values up very much, drive them up very high. In the Bobby Baker hearings, we find a reference to this island and to this deal, because one of the people who admitted having transmitted funds as kickbacks to Bobby Baker explained his presence in Miami back in 1960 by saying that the man he represented, who was Clint Murchison down in Texas, the big oil millionaire, a man who's put money into Nixon's campaigns for many, many years, he explained, this man Tom Webb, said, I was down in Miami because Murchison and I were interested in getting a causeway built. And the man who was putting pressure on the Miami City Council was a man called Leonard Burton, who I will come back to later, but who was a man who lobbied frequently for the Murchisons and for the Teamsters. And it seems quite clear that the Murchisons were hoping to get a Teamsters pension fund loan to build that causeway out to that island. All of this figures because I've been told frequently, though I've never seen it in print, that when Mr. Nixon lived out here in Los Angeles, he lived in Truesdale Estates, which was another real estate deal funded by the Murchisons with the help of the Teamsters Pension Fund. Well, I'll come back to the name the name Leonard Burton later, but there's another deal that Rebozo got Nixon into in Key Biscayne, which is a much more suspicious deal because this land is land that has been churned through many, many successive owners in the 26 years now, since 1946, the end of World War II. But at any stage you want to look, you do see links to organized crime. At the very beginning, the land was bought by a Cuban emigre politician called Jose Aleman. He was an emigre because, according to Cuban sources, he'd stolen anywhere between $60 million and $170 million of the Cuban official treasury. And I'm not making up these exaggerated figures. If you go back to the press in 1946, 47, 48, you'll see many public references to this theft and to the fact that it was later invested in at least $50 million worth of Florida real estate then, and you can imagine how much that would be worth now. Actually, federal investigators at the time suspected that the story about stealing the money might be just a cover story, and that, I'm quite serious about that, in fact, that a lot of this money might be money that Lucky Luciano had taken out of the country, money that had been made in the narcotics traffic and was now being brought back in under the cover of Jose Aleman. Well, whatever it is, that land has gone through many, many owners since then. I'll just mention, for example, a law firm that was involved in fending off the Internal Revenue people who were very interested in these deals. One of the lawyers was named in the Kefauver hearings for his role in corrupting the local sheriff of Miami. Another partner of that law firm, this is dealing with land which is now owned by Richard Nixon and Bibi Rebozo. One of the members of that law firm is today a fugitive from justice because of his role in a stock deal in which he was indicted with none other than the brother of the president of Resorts International that Bibi Rebozo phoned to make sure that his stock wasn't stolen. Another law firm was involved, included one lawyer who was named to the bench by Richard Nixon and was on the bench in time to hear the case which involved B.B. Rebozo's stolen stock, and it's no surprise to me, at any rate, that he ruled in favor of the Bank of Key Biscayne, Rebozo's bank, and against the New York Insurance Company. That case, for sure, will be appealed, and I suspect that all of us will be hearing more about that case before it is through. The main real estate company that was involved in churning these deals through owner after owner was called Keys Realty, about which many questions were asked in the Kefauver hearings in 1950. And today we're interested in that company again because one of its vice presidents, a man called Eugenio Martinez, resigned in 1971 and set up his own little real estate venture called Amoritas, which many people suspect was in fact a front for the Watergate operation, because it's certainly a matter of record now that Eugenio Martinez was found in the Democratic headquarters in last June and has since been convicted for his part in the Watergate conspiracy. Well, I could go on and on in this way. I just like to bring it up to the present by saying that today Richard Nixon holds some of that land. He didn't declare the lots for 4 years. It now seems that he didn't register his ownership of those lots because he knew very well that the mortgages on that land were still being held by a man called Arthur Desser, who was very close to the Teamsters Fund, had bought the land with the help of a Teamsters loan, and had drawn special attention to himself by being in 1963 one of the directors of a bank called the Miami National Bank down in Miami, which a Democratic attorney, district attorney later established, and this has never been challenged, was, while Mr. Desser was a director of it, being used primarily as a conduit to launder funds coming out of Meyer Lansky's casinos in Las Vegas. And another of the directors at this time was the same James Lawrence King, whom Nixon appointed to the bench. There's a very tight organization there in Miami, and you might say, well, what's the California connection in that? Well, I could bring it back to California in many ways, but I only have, as I said, 10 minutes. And so what I'll do is just read the first paragraph of a story which came out recently in the Oakland Tribune, who I think can be trusted on this particular story. 2 Nixon ex-aides linked to Teamster Union Fund probe. And I'll just read the first paragraph. A former top White House aide to President Nixon who reportedly raised sizable secret funds from Teamster Union officials. Some of you may recognize that is Murray Chotiner, an old friend, an old name for many of you here. Secret campaigns funds, later in the story it says was over $1 million, from Teamster Union officials, pension funds, and Las Vegas gamblers, interceded in the massive federal investigation of some Teamsters leaders and their associates in the Beverly Ridge Estates scandal here in Los Angeles, which I'm sure many of you remember. Who got indicted finally in that scandal? One of the men who got indicted for the abuse of Teamsters pension funds was the same Leonard Burton who was trying to arrange for the causeway to be built out to Fisher's Island back in 1959 and 1960. Another was a man called Irving Davidson, again a lobbyist for the Teamsters, a lobbyist for the Murchisons, a registered agent for the foreign government of Nicaragua. And I think I will close by bringing this back to Nixon by quoting from a letter which Irving Davidson, as agent for Nicaragua, sent to Luis Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, back in 1960 at the time of the Democratic Convention then, where he said, I have made available to the Johnson camp, that's the Lyndon Johnson camp at the Democratic Convention, the strength et al. Of the labor, money, delegates, hospitality votes, etc., which I will make available to the Republican nominee in Chicago at the end of this month. The services that I have made available to them are invaluable, since through 900 locals throughout the United States, I have made available to them 12,000 militant workers. And then a little later, he sent another message to Somoza saying, you can be sure that if it is not Johnson, it will be Nixon, and we will be with the winner. Now, I'd like to come back to a theme mentioned by one or two other people tonight, we mustn't just think it's all Nixon or all Haldeman or all Ehrlichman or all Mitchell. What it really is the system that goes to both conventions and tries to make sure that in both parties they have lined up a candidate who will be subservient in that way, who make these enormous amounts of money available. The significance of the relatively paltry land deals that Nixon has been involved in and that I have been talking about tonight is in that showing to them that he is available for these little deals, he has made himself their man. He cannot now turn around and attack them and expose them, and that explains this spinelessness of the man through the last 6 months. And it is, I think, time, in that context, to close. I have gone over my time by repeating what it was that Ralph Salerno said. Organized crime will put a man in the White House someday, and he won't even know it until they send him the bill.
I would like to introduce the philosopher and historian Richard Popkin from the University of California at San Diego, whose sensational series, later incorporated into a book called The Second Oswald, made history in the most prestigious American intellectual and literary magazine newspaper, the New York Review of Books. His work, his research as a historian and a philosopher has had to take and give equal place to his work in this field which has now come to the fore, this decade of conspiracy from Dallas to the Watergate. Dr. Richard Popkin.
Thank you. For years, those of us who thought it might be the case that the murders of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and the wounding of Governor Wallace might be the result of some sort of conspiratorial action by parties unknown, were treated as paranoid crackpots. Every political assassination in the last decade, we were told, was the work of one lone nut. Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, Sirhan, and Arthur Bremer, each isolated individuals with no contacts with anyone. From the day of Kennedy's death in 1963, the one lone nut theory became an axiom of historical explanation for American events. Allen Dulles, late head of the CIA, told the first meeting of the Warren Commission that he had researched the matter back to early American history and always found that in America, political assassinations were always the work of one individual. They were never conspiratorial plots. When Dulles was asked about Lincoln's case, he said one man so dominated the plot that it amounted to a one lone nut case. The rest of the world could have conspiracies, but not the United States. We could have the mafia, industrial cartels, but we couldn't have political conspiracies. When Nixon became our president, his legal mentor, John Mitchell, found types of political conspiracies unheard of before. In Chicago, he discovered that people who had never met each other, had never communicated with each other, had conspired to cause riots at the Democratic Convention. He found a similar situation in Seattle a little later on. He found that priests and nuns were conspiring to blow up tunnels in Washington and to kidnap our leading national asset, Henry Kissinger. And he found that Daniel Ellsberg and Tony Russo had conspired to betray the secrets of the disasters of our Vietnam policy to the American people. John Mitchell, despite an eagle eye for political conspiracy, managed to miss the major ones around him. The head of his criminal justice division had to resign for being part of a bank scandal in Texas. The Watergate buggers met in Mitchell's office with him, and he never noticed they were engaged in a political conspiracy. He helped to pay for the Watergate 7 for their trials, for their silence, and saw no conspiracy involved. We now know that Mitchell was part of a gigantic conspiracy to re-elect the president by any means necessary. As the conspiracy has been revealed up to this point, we know that it began in the wake of the catastrophic Mitchell-directed campaign of 1970, developed through the Mitchell-directed persecution in the New York Times for the publication of the Pentagon Papers, through the disaster of Nixon's Pakistan policy and the ITT scandal, a minor conspiracy to corrupt the Justice Department in order to make millions. The conspiracy, as known so far, involved the political destruction of Democratic candidates, burglary, wiretapping, the use of the CIA, FBI, and SEC for political purposes, the use of millions collected illegally from assorted millionaires and shady businessmen, the sabotaging of the campaign, and so on. Step by step, the Watergate conspiracy achieved its goal, the re-election of the president. When Watergate occurred, the official explanation was an expanded one lone nut theory. Mitchell at first said it might have been ordered by one of McCord's private clients. He actually said this the day after. Next, we were told it was a third-rate burglary done by clowns, a caper. Finally, that it was 7 lone nuts working in isolation who, for reasons known only to themselves, liked to listen to phone calls of Democratic leaders. Certainly a bizarre incident. Then, when the greatest bugger of them all, James McCord, decided to spill the beans, Nixon told us there were startling new developments. Although the president has not seen fit to tell us what these were, we now know that these included the confirmation of McCord's story and the confession of Magruder, as well as Dean's decision to reveal Watergate West, the robbery of Dr. Fielding's office. In the period of 1 month, we have been treated to the revelation of the most high-level criminal conspiracy in American history, directed by the chief aides of the president, involving the chiefs of the FBI and the CIA, top operatives of the latter, the leaders of the Justice Department, nationwide sabotage squads, and who knows who else. All this involving the commission of all sorts of felonies done to re-elect the president. The rationale for the amazing events, as far as we've been told, was that the president went into a fury about the fact that some people opposed him. We're told he can't stand criticism, can't stand people except for Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Rebozo and his family. Bach Mai Hospital had to be destroyed because, quote, the president got angry. The picture we now have is that the president has been and still is a completely isolated individual who never reads the newspapers or watches TV except for the Washington Redskins games. The president has violent reactions and then acts in unpredictable ways. All this adds up to the president being one lonely nut. Presiding over a fantastic conspiratorial apparatus that sees its opposition as a paranoid conspiracy to be destroyed by any means, legal or otherwise. In view of what is already public knowledge, the conspiracy involved keeping Teddy Kennedy from running, weakening Senators Muskie, Humphrey, and Jackson, framing Ellsberg and Russo, pushing for McGovern and Eagleton's nomination, destruction of Eagleton, the arrangement to sabotage of the campaign. Then the conspiracy went on, corrupting the head of the FBI and lots of others to obstruct justice. After Nixon's statement in August about Dean's report and Kleindienst's claim that the investigation of the Watergate was the most thorough one since the Warren Commission, everyone should have been alerted. A thought is sweeping the country. If such a monumental conspiracy could have been going on involving top officials and the FBI and the CIA, financed by money of millionaires all over the country, then maybe 4 major events that determined the history of the last decade, the shootings of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and Governor Wallace, might also have been the results of such conspiracies. Each case was quickly closed, declared the result of the actions of an isolated, powerless nut. But now that we know the level of conspiratorial activity, perhaps the many loose ends, inconsistencies in these areas are due to similar conspiracies. Many important people are now considering these possibilities. To speak the unspeakable, It's occurred to many that the conspiracy to re-elect the president would not have worked without the shooting of Governor Wallace. The conspiracy might have resulted in McGovern's nomination and his botched campaign. But if Governor Wallace had also run, we would not know tonight who had been elected. The votes would still be being counted. Scenarios like that in Don Freed and Mark Lane's novel Executive Action might have seemed far out when written last year, namely the idea that the CIA, right-wing politicians, and Texas millionaires might have conspired to kill the president. Now is such a scenario implausible or even improbable? All sorts of crimes were committed to re-elect the president. Why not to change presidents? Some still shrink and say robbery, bugging, perjury are not like killing. Yet we know that a branch of our government engages in political assassination outside the country. The former head of the Political Assassination Division of the CIA, Mr. Colby, has just last week been nominated to head the CIA. At the moment, I know only of a few items that suggest a connection to the Watergate and the previous political assassinations. But in each of the assassinations, there is much that remains suspicious, and investigators have met with almost total frustration by the governmental authorities in gaining access to information. Courts have refused to entertain motions for rehearings, even the most suspicious case, that of James Earl Ray. Much material regarding John Kennedy still is classified. It's time to demand a reopening of all four cases so that we can discover whether or not we've been living in a continuous conspiracy or a continuous series of conspiracies from Dallas to Watergate. We must regain confidence in and control over our government. Part of this will involve the fate of our president. I, like others, think the lonely nut could be impeached for what is now known. But given the unprecedented nature of the situation, I'm trying to start a suit to annul the last election on grounds of fraud and theft of the election. My lawyer, Judge Roger Ruffin of San Diego, is prepared to launch the suit if other lawyers and plaintiffs will join with us. If we can go back a year or a decade, maybe we can finally go forward and work on our genuine and basic social problems. So let's found a committee to diselect the president. Thank you.
I now will only describe 3 charts which give you the roughest kind of overview of Operation Gemstone. This is the chain of command, and it's laid out like an espionage or intelligence network, for it's as if a group were invading the United States from within in order to bring about a coup de main. That is a stealthy, fatal blow from within the government, for it had nothing to do, finally, with the re-election of the president, since he led in the polls by enormous numbers after the Wallace assassination attempt. It had to do with power, not re-election for 4 more years. If you remember, the Reichstag fire was engineered by the Third Reich after, not before, but after Hitler was chancellor. He was already chancellor. What he was not yet was dictator. Here we have organized crime, corrupt unions, big business, and intelligence fronts. Their creature is Nixon. Mitchell is his internal security agent, and a gyroscopic career that covers the funding and the network and chain of command. But the 2 station chiefs, to stick to the clandestine vocabulary, are on we have here the West Coast, Haldeman, the station chief, Chapin, the executive cutoff, Strawn, the field cutoff, Segretti, the control, and on the West Coast were to be Black, Chicano, and Jesus freaks hired as agents provocateurs in San Diego to cause violence in the streets while explosions took place inside the convention hall, at which point evidence would have been found in the Democratic National Committee in Washington on forged letterhead, which would have made the election nothing but a mechanical gesture, as they would in all effects have been canceled. The country, Nixon's overwhelming mandate, would have gone forward. And E. Howard Hunt and James McCord were far more than simple ex-FBI and CIA agents. They were super agents, each of who sat on Pentagon national security committees, who were to come to life in times of crisis and emergency to censorship, in the censorship of news and the roundup of dissidents and rebellious elements. Now I'm paraphrasing the SAD SAD group. McCord and Hunt, until the day of their arrests, sat on special Pentagon emergency committees. The East Coast is Charles Colson, Liddy is the executive cutoff, Hunt the field cutoff, McCord the control, and the field agents from the East Coast were to be anti-Castro Cubans, as you've seen, and Young Americans for Freedom, those same forces now who've intervened in the Bradley campaign to try to make Jane Fonda the issue and to try to create a number of provocative incidents to distract both from Watergate nationally, the Bradley campaign locally. Hunt was one of the founders of Young Americans for Freedom, as were other right-wing Central Intelligence Agency elements. Colson, and we could perhaps get into this in a larger discussion in a few weeks from now, Colson, in my opinion, was the professional. He hired Hunt, the other super agent. Colson is a double agent. He was named, you noticed yesterday on the television hearings when they said, what was Mr. Colson's job? He was liaison from the committee to re-elect the president. To who, said Weicker? Oh, to the American Legion, to other groups. He was liaison to far more other groups than the American Legion. And it is Colson alone who may escape indictment. It is Colson who set some of these others up. Moral morons that they are, they did not dream up Operation Gemstone. It was professional, it was military, it was war, and it was done by professionals, and then venal, ambitious, and ideological fanatics, men like Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, fools, and knaves, and ideologues were used and acted on it and furthered it, and they have been caught, and they will be indicted, and they will go to jail. Whether the mystery man Charles Colson, with his links to the neo-fascist elements in this country, will be exposed or not, we do not know. That's something that we have to be concerned with, and not just the cover-up. Next is the cash flow. The lines in green is cash. It comes from organized crime, corrupt unions, big business and intelligence fronts. It's washed. It goes into Stan safe and Haldeman safe. And then the conduits are Kalmbach and Segretti on the West Coast, Liddy and Barker on the East Coast. Here's the cover-up chart. Nixon and Ziegler at the head. The White House cover-up, the burning and destruction of files, is Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, Gray, Peterson, and the Justice Department. The covert, the buying off of people, the subordination of perjury, and in the case of Dorothy Hunt, as in the case of Dita Beard and Martha Mitchell, the 3 acts of violence so far, one of them resulting in a death, are the 3 women who have been the victims of acts of violence. Dorothy Hunt is dead, but Mitchell, Magruder, Kalmbach, Hunt, the dead Dorothy Hunt, and she was the link to the contract agents. In the middle from Ziegler is Colson again, the YAF, right-wing media, and overt public propaganda. The attempt to destroy Senator Ervin, the attempt to make the Pentagon Papers, Jane Fonda, and others, the attempt to say that there would be riots in the street, and that there would be violence in San Diego and in Miami. That same blind, mindless, mechanical, paranoid anti-communism or anti-insurgency which has justified a quarter of a century of Cold War was, of course, as Frantz Fanon, the third world psychoanalyst, predicted, in the third phase of violence, it comes home to the mother country. Richard Nixon was the creature and the conduit for the violence that America has visited in pitiless and remorseless style and fashion for 25 years. It's flowed, it's backed up now, it's been reversed in the field by the enormous victories of the people in Indochina. It's flowed backward to America and is now washing over us, and we are bound hand and foot now, like so many natives in so many foreign countries. And we now, too, can strip off those bounds. We cannot fall lower. America has become the name of a nervous disease, and this tip of the iceberg and the huge monolith of the iceberg that Professors Popkin and Scott have described to us should be just the first step in bringing information to the people, acting coherently and logically, talking with groups in churches, in lodges, in our political parties, in our political clubs, in our neighborhoods, knowing, the right to know, and the need to know, and then taking many, many steps, the first of which is the expungement from American life of these scum who have bombed women and children abroad and duped the American public at home.
Tonight you will hear participants from our previous Watergate special, Donald Freed and Richard Popkin, expand their analysis and scenarios on the Watergate conspiracy. Mr. Freed has written Executive Action, a novel of fact about the assassination of President Kennedy. He sees a link between the death of Kennedy and the present-day political sabotage. Professor Popkin shares this belief in a conspiracy being responsible for the 1963 assassination. He also sees a conspiratorial link between Watergate and the deaths of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the attempted murder of George Wallace. Some of this information that you will hear tonight will actually be a preview of the Senate Select Committee's hearings, which will be broadcast live on KPFK. This program was produced by Stephen Blum.
The Watergate break-in was nothing but a dramatic incident that was a convenient rallying point for the media. The tip of the iceberg began with the Watergate break-in. The iceberg itself has to be seen as a vast and monolithic superstructure. I'm talking now only about the tip of the iceberg. Operation Gemstone has to be described in the terminology and diagram of a clandestine intelligence operation, exactly as one would describe a coup de main, a stealthy attempt from within the government to take power. Not electoral power, not simply 4 more years, but the kind of power which no democracy with its checks and balances allows. Now, the superstructure that I've abstracted on this chart, and indeed on all of them, is organized crime, corrupt unions, big business, a kind of a label, especially for the national organizations, and intelligence fronts. The intelligence front in Operation Gemstone is the committee to re-elect the president. Nixon and Mitchell. Nixon is, of course, the representative in every way of these forces and has been so since he first answered a classified ad to run for Congress those many years ago. One of the sponsors of that ad is about to be indicted. He's from San Diego, and Dr. Popkin will talk about him. Mitchell played the role of internal security, the president's agent, that is to say, who was responsible for monitoring what came in and what flowed out of the White House. The East Coast is represented here by Charles Colson. He would be the equivalent of a station chief in the way that in a foreign country a diplomat represents the United States interests, but the Central Intelligence Agency will work out of the American embassy in a foreign country, and from there the clandestine, the training of police, the various propaganda operations will go forward. And of course these activities center around usually elections in these countries, as in Chile, for example. Colson would be the equivalent then of the station chief, the man in charge of plans. And it's as if, of course, that we were simply natives or colonized subjects, and a group of settlers or neocolonialists were organizing in a clandestine manner from within the country and from within the government to set in motion the equivalent American style of a military putsch or a coup de main. But it would be from within the government, from within power itself, in the same way that the Reichstag incident was staged after Hitler was chancellor, not before, but after. He was already chancellor. He had the majority of the vote. What he did not have was dictatorial power. And that is why, long after Nixon ran way ahead of McGovern in the polls, it was not stupidity that kept this Operation Gemstone in motion. The winning and the re-election of the presidency was only a minor and first step in Operation Gemstone. Under Colson comes Gordon Liddy, and he would be known in clandestine terms as the executive cutoff. And you can see that it took the most intense pressure to break this compartmentalization down. Liddy, for the longest time, was the beginning and the end of the conspiracy, and so the government argued before Judge Sirica. The compartmentalization held until McCord broke. Under Liddy is Hunt, the field cutoff. And under Hunt is McCord, the control or agent handler, the man who runs the contract agents in the field. And under McCord on the East Coast, of course, were YAF, Young Americans for Freedom, anti-Castro Cubans, and some other right-wing forces, almost all associated with the Central Intelligence Agency, not as employees. None of these people exist in the Central Intelligence Agency files. They are what are called contract agents. They do not exist on paper. On the West Coast, Haldeman is the station chief, and when these charts are revised, Ehrlichman will be in that little box with him. Haldeman and Ehrlichman are the equivalent of the diplomat at an American mission or at an American embassy, the diplomatic representation of the White House. Colson is the professional, the super conspirator. Haldeman and the others are, shall we say, consummate and brilliant amateurs, but they are amateurs. And although they did everything to finance and forward and cover up Operation Gemstone, they did not think it up. There was plenty of input, as they like to say, in the advertising agencies that spawned men like Haldeman and Ziegler and Dean and others. But this conspiracy is my argument, and the argument of the Citizens Research and Investigating Committee, is the work of a professional. And the professionals are Colson and Hunt, basically, with McCord as the technician. Haldeman and Ehrlichman then would be the equivalent of ambassadors or diplomats. Chapin would be the executive cutoff for the West Coast wing of Operation Gemstone. Chapin and Strawn, rather, would be the field cutoffs. Chapin, the executive cutoff, Strawn, the field cutoff, Donald Segretti, the control or agent handler, and he would run the agents on the West Coast, the contract agents. Those would have been black, Chicano, Jesus freaks. They were being hired, they were being organized. The final act, the bottom line of Operation Gemstone, were riots in the streets in San Diego, sponsored by agents provocateurs, and violence through the use of explosives within inside the convention hall. This violence would have been laid at the door of anti-war, liberal, left, radical, McGovern forces. The proof would have been a variation on the Pentagon Papers theme. Information in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington at Watergate would have been leaked from the files, tying McGovern to these forces. Where would this information have come from? And this is new information tonight. That information was being planted on June 16, 17, 1972, when McCord and the others in evening clothes and rubber gloves were arrested at gunpoint. That Operation Gemstone was aborted, and we saw only vestigial evidence of it when Agnew and others, with the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, attempted to point out provocation coming from anti-war forces. Of course, it did not materialize, and they knew it would not, and so the widespread use of agents provocateurs. When San Diego, because of ITT and other reasons, had to be given up, and the movement was to Miami, where the demonstrations could be controlled more perfectly, then Cubans and Young Americans for Freedom replaced black, Chicano, and Jesus freaks, the contract agents provocateurs from the West Coast. This would, in effect, have canceled the elections. There would have been an election, but you can expect Nixon to have gotten 95 to 99% of the vote. Had GOP notables lost their lives in explosions inside the GOP convention, and proof been leaked from the DNC that this was tied to McGovern, all intents and purposes, the Operation Gemstone would have been in high gear. And from the POW extravaganza, they would have gone directly into the American Revolutionary Bicentennial Program, which was to tie in labor unions, students, schools, service groups, churches, armed forces groups, American Legion groups, business, industry, banking, savings and loan. Decals would have been spread across the country. Any group or individual without a decal would have been highly visible as being un-American. It would have made the McCarthy era look like peanuts, because instead of identifying un-American elements, it would simply have identified American elements. That is a fait accompli. And the American Bicentennial, which does not come until 1976, was precisely for that reason begun 4 years early in 1972. And it would have eventuated in parades, in extravaganzas, in torchlight demonstrations. The Leni Riefenstahl films of Hitler Germany in the 30s were being studied by the Committee for the American Bicentennial, and we could have looked forward to enormous sports stadium spectaculars with lights and flags and excitement, not to say hysteria, that would have been modeled very closely on the spectaculars of the Third Reich in Germany in the 1930s. That was the plan, to go from Gemstone to the POWs to the Bicentennial. But it was aborted, partially, and we now have some small insight. And we must seize this lever, this thin end of the wedge, which the media and other forces have developed, and push as never before. The next chart is the cash flow. Again, organized crime, corrupt unions, big business, intelligence front. The money is washed, as they say in clandestine vocabulary. Part of it goes into, the broken line is the washed money. It goes from Stans to Haldeman into Kalmbach. On the West Coast, the primary conduit is Haldeman, the president's personal counsel, Kalmbach, to Segretti, to the field agents. On the East Coast, it's Liddy to Barker, the Cuban, to the field agents. The money, you can speak forever about it. It goes as deep and as broad as you wish to discuss. That's just a very high order abstraction of some of the cash flow. It goes up over $10 million for Operation Gemstone, approximating a third of the some $50 million raised for the re-election of the president. Over $10 million and over 100 field agents identified at this point. This is proof positive that we are not contemplating a budget or an itinerary or the recruitment for a break-in of several offices, one in Beverly Hills, one in Washington, several in New York. The break-in is not even the tip of the iceberg. The last chart is the cover-up, and which is still in motion. From the White House itself through Ziegler, missing on there is Viva, of course, and the POW, which has to be prominently described. Through Colson, the master of propaganda, through Young Americans for Freedom, Viva, right-wing media. That's the open, overt propaganda campaign to cover up the attempt to get Jane Fonda, the attempt to shift the headlines, and so forth. That battle has partially already been lost by the White House, and that, of course, is what is fatal. And that's why it's terribly important that the Irvin plan of a slow, steady development means everything, because in ratio to the amount of time that elapses now is how much can come out. The covert on the White House, the burning and destruction of documents, of course, goes Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, Gray, Peterson, and the Justice Department. That's the outright covert destruction of evidence. The buying off, the use of money, of bribery, and of threats runs down from Mitchell to Magruder, Kalmbach, Hunt, Dorothy Hunt, also a longtime CIA agent, Howard Hunt's wife, who's dead. Evidence points to her having been murdered as she tried to get out of Operation Gemstone and was talking to the press, beginning to talk to the press. She's dead, and from there to the contract agents, who were some of them already in jail, some of them around the country, waiting to see whether they would be paid off. At this point, I'll save whatever else I have to say for a question and answer period and introduce someone to you who's a really very extraordinary person. He's well known for his book, which was really a classic of meticulous research, The Second Oswald, which was serialized in the New York Review of Books and published by Avon, and was the one book that dealt in a popular sense. For those who didn't understand ballistics and logistics and the scientific data of Dallas, The Second Oswald was shocking and unarguable proof of a conspiracy. But besides, he happens to be a very well-known philosopher and historian, and formerly head of the philosophy department at UCSD, and a very wide-ranging career indeed in politics and literature and history and philosophy, and someone you're going to enjoy very much, I think, and who it's my pleasure to unleash now, Professor Richard Popkin.
Thank you. And each time one talks about the Watergate, can't tell what the state of the argument is unless you heard the car radio a minute ago. And so I spoke up in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago, but I think things have moved so fast and so far that I'd like to deal with a different aspect of it first today, and I think we'll be dealing with another aspect a week or so from now. What seems to be the central issue, which is going to be the bombshell of next week, is what was referred to in the original introduction, this 1970 plan to get rid of all the opponents in the United States. The plan was stolen from the White House by Mr. Dean and placed in the safe deposit box. The keys were given to Judge Sirica. The White House first apparently didn't know what he had stolen. I'm not sure they know to this day all that he's stolen, since they seem to be mainly concerned about one document. And they gingerly start asking for their papers back. Good old Judge Sirica offered them their papers back after he Xeroxed them and gave a set to the Irwin Committee and Senator Symington's committee. It's through Symington that we're beginning to get some clues as to what this is all about. Senator Symington said on the 22nd of May, "This is the most fantastic document I've ever read." He's given a couple of interviews to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and some to the New York Times and the Washington Post. In the meantime, as Nixon and his friends appreciated what had been taken, Nixon, we're told in the latest issue of Time magazine, got all that remains of his staff, his few remaining friends, to work feverishly on this incredible 4,000-word document that was issued last week. And it's the first time in the history of the presidency of the United States that anything like this has happened. The president has been issuing a lawyer's brief, won't discuss it, but has to make sure it's on the record before things move too fast. Well, Nixon says, and I don't know if people had the patience to go through it, about 1/3 of the document is on the stolen paper of Mr. Dean. And Nixon says in his statement, "The documents spelling out this 1970 plan are extremely sensitive. They include and are based upon assessments of certain foreign intelligence capabilities and procedures, which, of course, must remain secret." And if one reads through Nixon's description of the importance of keeping this secret, the main point of his talk, or at least one of the major points, is to try and keep this a classified secret document. Since Nixon's talk, there have been analyses of it in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in Time, Newsweek, the London Observer, all based upon leaked information as to what's in this 1970 plan. And just today, this morning, we heard that Senator Ervin is just horrified, having read for the first time what this 1970 plan is. Senator Weicker yesterday was giving a commencement address in Connecticut on it, and Weicker says about it, "We've heard in recent days there's a slogan within elements of the Justice Department that the Constitution is not meant to be a suicide pact. And the rewriting of it in the 1970 plan is to make sure it's not a suicide pact for certain people. Well, what's the plan? As far as we know, from New York Times has published 4 articles on it. The Washington Post has had several. Time magazine goes through a fairly careful putting together of it without ever quoting it. That the plan, as Nixon tells us, grew out of a catastrophic situation in 1970 when the FBI had stopped taking the White House seriously on what it was supposed to investigate. And then New York Times has gotten a fair amount of background that Nixon, when he couldn't get the FBI to take it seriously, then tried to get the CIA. The CIA found that what was supposed to be investigated was to find out the foreign sources of the revenue of the students, the Black Panthers, and the Arabs in America. And for some reason, the Arabs in America figure very large in this, as we'll see in a moment. The CIA sent Nixon a 200-page analysis of what he was asking for, trying to teach him some elementary sociology, that the country was in ferment because there are problems in the country, that racism happens to go on and some people don't like it, that the Vietnam War was going on and the students didn't like it, and hence they didn't need foreign support, foreign agitation. They had enough local problems to get them started. With the FBI and the CIA refusing to cooperate, we're then told by Nixon that the matter was so serious that he called an emergency meeting of all the chiefs of intelligence of the 2 large agencies, the FBI and the CIA, the National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, and some other small secret ones, to sit around and figure out what to do. They drafted a plan. Hoover was the head of the committee. They drafted a plan which was sent to the president. Most of the work in the plan is by the man who's referred to in your introduction, Mr. Houston, in which they were going back, we're told, to procedures that had been carried on in this country from 1941 to 66. Procedures which Senator Symington called a license for unlimited burglary. Nixon called, with a new euphemism that will go down in history, a means of surreptitious entry. The plan apparently was to burglarize all the opponents and to burglarize embassies that might be giving them money. It's also a plan to intercept the mail, cut off communications, and whatever else was necessary. And I think we're going to find some rather amazing things because both Symington and Irwin have promised to print the plan next week. Well, we're told what they were doing was a series of activities that have been going on in this country by the FBI from 1941 to 66. That they were stopped in 1966, almost casually, by Ramsey Clark when he was asked by the FBI if they minded if they burglarized another embassy. And he reports he told him it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, and wrote it all out for him. And Hoover kept his letter, possibly kept it under his pillow, but had it with him in 1970 when Nixon wanted him to start this all over again, that Hoover wrote a series of objections to the order. And these objections include the news that he got from Ramsey Clark that it all happens to be illegal. Time magazine indicates that the purloined paper of Mr. Dean is Hoover's copy, that it's a copy with annotations by Hoover as to all the reasons he's giving for why he won't do it. It went to the president, or at least since nobody talks to the president, we have reason to believe it went to the president. The copy is marked the president's copy, and not either Mr. Haldeman, Ehrlichman's, or Mitchell's, or anybody else, but the copy that's in existence is the president's copy. So it went to him. We don't know whether he read it. At any rate, he issued the order in spite of all of Hoover's objections, and Hoover just apparently refused to do anything about it. 5 days later, the order was withdrawn, and the president says boldly it was never implemented. And since it was never implemented, we're then told in a background story in the New York Times that crisis broke out as to what the hell were they going to do if they couldn't carry on their business this way. And the crisis, as reported by President's present counsel, Mr. Garment, was they were convinced the Arabs in this country were about to do something awful. And if one remembers the world, do you see another Xerox page? The world of summer of 1970, number of Arabs in America was not a very large number. But in spite of this, Mr. Garment reports they were going to have meetings, here's the page, try and settle a Middle East question. Here we were on the eve of Mideast talks with information that the Arab commandos were going to start killing leaders in the Jewish community in America. What were we going to do? We were helpless. So what he says, what they did is they asked the Israelis about it. And the suggestion in the interview is not only ask the Israelis did it, burglarized whatever embassy had to be burglarized, and quieted down their nerves for a moment. But in quieting down their nerves, they then found a state of affairs in which the major intelligence agencies wouldn't accept the paranoid interpretation of the world that was emanating from the White House. And the White House wasn't going to give up its paranoid interpretation. And so it's from this that various agencies we just discovered existing came into being. The Internal Evaluation Service, is it? The Intelligence Evaluation Service, and something else, which McCord stumbled upon and was getting memos from. And Jack Anderson's been publishing their memos, which are extremely paranoid about the riot in San Diego, which they're talking about 500,000 people coming to San Diego. They're buying thousands of guns. They're making armored tanks. This whole scheme and the paranoia that's involved in it actually begins with Nixon's arrival on the scene. The first thing Mitchell gets involved in as head of the Justice Department is a decision in the Supreme Court in 1969 about wiretapping. Supreme Court rules against Mitchell's side, and Mitchell, unlike any other secretary of the Justice Department before him, interferes with the process of the Supreme Court. And we've learned he sent somebody around to try and get the Supreme Court to reconsider the case on the grounds that there was national security that they didn't realize. Supreme Court refused to consider it, so Mitchell made a decision that it was up to him to decide whether national security warranted wiretapping. And it took from 1969 to 1971 to get the court to decide that Mitchell can't write the laws himself. They have to be passed by somebody, and it doesn't happen to be a law which says that the Justice Department has the right to wiretap who it wants. So from 1969 to 71, we know he was doing it. And was doing it partly because of these leaks from the government, but mainly, it appears, because of their panic about the blacks, the students, and the counterculture. And one element which I think is going to loom large in this, that one of the things that starts immediately along with Mitchell's desire to wiretap is the repression of the drug culture. And Operation Intercept, which is September 1969, is part of this overall scheme to suppress all the tendencies that Nixon and his friends couldn't stand. And I think we're going to find that some of what was going on in the background of Operation Gemstone is involved with the drug problem. A story appeared a couple of weeks ago in the Washington Post that within the first month that Nixon was in office, some leading pharmacologist was called to Washington and told by Eagle Crow, later one of the plumbers, that if he didn't agree with the White House on what to do about the drug problem, and the pharmacologists from Cornell had the view that one should treat it as a medical problem and investigate it medically, he was told if he didn't agree with the White House as a police problem, that the White House would destroy him, were Eagle Crow's words to him. And apparently they went ahead and tried to destroy the research of anybody who didn't agree with them. Well, it's all these efforts to get control of the opposition that they saw that after the FBI and the CIA wouldn't cooperate, then they start creating their own units. And then we're told that our president went out of his mind, got absolutely furious, didn't know what this man Ellsberg was likely to do. If he'd do something as terrible as give the New York Times those papers, God knows what else he might do. And they immediately had to go find out what sort of a demon they were dealing with. And hence, dispatch of Hunt, Liddy, and the Cubans to Los Angeles to go get into the psychiatrist. Apparently, when the FBI asked the psychiatrist, was Ellsberg crazy, and he wouldn't discuss the case, that wasn't enough. So they had to find out more, and Hunt's, what's the term they use? They had to find out about his prosecutability. Since they seem to have thought he really was crazy. Anybody who would do something of this order. And so as a result of Ellsberg, that we get the plumbers. That no agency other than the one in the White House is sufficient to deal with this. And from then on, the plumbers are going around burglarizing, and we're gradually finding out more and more burglaries. I think we're up to 5, and it seems from the scheduling of these things that Hunt never took a day off, and any day he was in a city where there was a place worth burglarizing, they did it. And something I'm baffled about it, in terms of your charts, in terms of our general view that Hunt must be the best spy this country had, that he always burglarizes with a crowbar. That the job that was done in Los Angeles, that was done in the Watergate, that was done in the NAACP headquarters in New York, that was done in the green-spun safe in Las Vegas, are all done with crowbars, and they just make a mess out of the place. And there's absolutely no effort to hide the fact that the robbery has gone on. And what's surprising is, given the amount of robbery that occurs, everybody except for the Democrats assumed it was normal robbery and made nothing out of it. And now suddenly everybody's realizing that their robbery was something more significant, and we're beginning to get the pattern out of this. Well, with all this set up, then we start getting the actual Operation Gemstone. And I think the actual Operation Gemstone stems from the 1970 campaign that Mr. Mitchell, who I think we'll find is much more the evil genius of all this than he now appears, since at the present stage of the argument, it's Mr. Dean leaking a lot of information as to what's wrong with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and next stage, after we get done with the Dean 1970 paper, then I think we'll get back to what's wrong with Mr. Mitchell. And Mr. Mitchell was Nixon's campaign manager for 1970, in which the Republicans were going to gain control of Congress. And they were going to gain control of Congress by this law and order campaign of suppressing the counterculture. And you may remember the campaign came to a bad end in San Jose when Nixon appeared in a parade. A riot occurred, a so-called riot, somebody threw a rock at him. Took the reporters about an hour to find out it was a paid rock thrower. And the San Jose riot failed to be this one that Don describes that was going to take place at San Diego, where they'd really have a riot. The last day of the campaign consisted of 2 speeches. Nixon raving in Phoenix on TV about this riot in San Jose, need for law and order and so on, and then after him, Mr. Muskie sitting calmly by his seafront in Maine about how we should be reasonable, consider the problems of this country, and so on. And the contrast between this raving maniac and Muskie then made it appear to the voters, as the polls indicated, that Mr. Muskie was going to be the next president of the United States. At this point, we get what has now been labeled by Charles Taft, the son of Senator Taft, in his report of the Fair Campaign Practices Committee that was issued last weekend, a conscious conspiracy to violate laws, to manipulate voters, and to make a mockery of the democratic system of self-government. Mr. Taft's committee has published a long report giving the details as to how they did it, in which structured first to make sure Muskie couldn't be a candidate, Senator Kennedy couldn't be a candidate. Muskie, we're beginning to see, was destroyed by these fake letters by various people sent to break up Muskie meetings, to disarrange his schedule, to antagonize voters. And I think in a month or two we're going to find thousands of what Don calls contact agents here who were doing nasty little things which had the effect of getting rid of all of Muskie's strength. Because it did appear sort of amazing that Muskie began 1972 as a sure winner in the Democratic convention and then couldn't carry the Polish ward in Milwaukee or Philadelphia. So the job was really thorough. Kennedy never got off the ground as a candidate, and the indication of why he didn't is that in Mr. Hunt's papers that were given to Mr. Gray to guard and later to burn, one is the fake cables about the late President Kennedy, the other is a file called Chappaquiddick. And nobody's asked Hunt yet, as far as I know, what was in the file about Chappaquiddick. They've asked him about the cable, and he's gone into lovely detail, which I'll mention some things about in a moment. Also, Mr. Caulfield, who you may have enjoyed last week, New York cop who looks like he's from a grade B night-night movie, who works on divorce cases and blackmails people, and he calls up the White House from pay phones and things. That's his story, that he got called up in the motel in San Clemente, was told to go out and put a dime in the booth and call up the White House, the Western White House, to get his instructions. Well, Caulfield also says he was working on Chappaquiddick, but nobody again asked him what is he working on. So we know of Caulfield and Hunt gathering enough crap about this to scare Kennedy away from being a candidate. Muskie got sandbagged through Segretti's activities and other people's, and I heard just yesterday that they've been able to find that both Hunt and Segretti were in San Diego back in February and March of 1972, arranging for people to disrupt Muskie's campaign if he ran the California primary. So the thing seems to have been organized fairly far in advance and got the job done. As the election season went on, it wasn't all roses for Nixon. The ITT scandal was blowing up. Jack Anderson was publishing very damaging documents, and the plumbers had to make sure that the Democratic Party was as weak as possible. It's in May that two remarkable events occur. One, that a leading candidate who would have made Nixon's election probably impossible, George Wallace, suddenly gets shot and can't run for public office anymore. If Wallace hadn't been shot, we'd still be counting the vote and still be trying to figure out who won the election. That he would have gotten a third of the vote, Nixon would have gotten around a third, and McGovern around a third. So just fortuitously, the one candidate who really mattered gets knocked off by, as usual, one lone nut, and who gets very quickly tried, declared insane, but not so insane they can't lock him up for life, and is cut off, and all information about him is cut off. The other amazing event is the burglarizing and the bugging of the Democratic headquarters. The explanation we've been given of this by the two participants who have appeared on TV, McCord and Barker. McCord explains how he has given all this news about the riot in San Diego, the menace building up to the Republican Party, and in his job as security officer for the Republican Party, what else could he do but try and find out whether it's all real? And McCord was tantalizing the senators by telling them he's getting these daily reports from the Intelligence Evaluation Service, and nobody asked him what these things say. Unfortunately, Jack Anderson is telling us what they say, and they're just absolutely screaming about the problems of this riot in San Diego. Barker, I think, is more a comedy relief to it, but Barker's testimony indicates that the team got sold on the view it must be relevant to national security. The national security somehow must be at what's at issue. And Barker tells us the information he's given about national security was the Cubans were financing McGovern. They're sending him $10 to $20 million. So they break into the headquarters, and Barker admits that they were either in the wrong office, so there's no such data, but since they're in an office, he might as well do something, so he starts burglarizing. And you may remember the marvelous scene when one of the senators asked Barker if he can really believe that the burglarizing of the Democratic headquarters has something to do with liberating Cuba. And Barker says, sometimes I get confused about these matters. But he's sure, he says, that if Mr. Hunt was for it, it must have something to do with national security. Well, if national security, which all this is enveloped in from the time they get into office, is a real issue, if there really is something we're supposed to be worried about, if the country is coming apart or there are foreign menaces and so on, why can't it be explained? Why can't they actually state what the problem is and what has to be done to safeguard the country and find out if people want the country saved or not? And if they want it saved, what price it'll take to save it? Instead of explaining it, this quotation I gave you from Weiker's speech yesterday, that people regard the Constitution as a suicide pact. If it really is a suicide pact in this day and age, and it's perfectly possible a document written in 1787 isn't really applicable in 1973, then some real effort should be made to consider what the state of affairs is, what laws we do need if we're really in danger, what constitutional changes ought to be made. Instead, nothing like this gets proposed. Instead, we're told the government was helpless. They had to do something to defend national security. So they do all these illegal things instead of trying to explain to the Congress, to the populace, that we're really in a bind and a fix and we need new laws. A couple of attempts to explain the problem were so preposterous they didn't convince anybody. The first attempt to explain the problem was in the case of the government of Mitchell against the New York Times, when the New York Times started printing the Pentagon Papers. If you remember, Mitchell rushed in the court to try and get the first injunction in American history against a prior publication, and in court after court, as the New York Times was stopped, and the Boston Globe and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times and other papers took on the job of printing the documents. In court after court, Mitchell tried to explain why it was necessary. And when they finally, a couple of days, got it up to the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court doctored by Mr. Nixon with lots of his friends on it, they still got a unanimous verdict against them. They couldn't convince anybody. In contrast to this state of affairs, where they're arguing about national security and can't make reasonable conservative people believe it, we've just seen a case in England where two ministers had to be removed because of their sex lives, that the Prime Minister of England immediately explained to Commons what the problem was. Everybody agrees, unfortunately, it's a problem. They have to solve it right away. And they've appointed an independent commission that everybody trusts, and there's no uproar at all about the problem anymore. the cases we're now being offered, which are enveloped in last week's testimony of national security, revolve around the laundering of $100,000 of a Texas oil millionaire's money that was sent from Houston to Mexico City to Mr. Stans to Mr. Barker. And day after day we're being told that this is the point at which the CIA had to stop the FBI from investigating the Watergate. And yesterday's testimony of Mr. Ehrlichman, I think, really indicates how far gone this case is. The CIA, at a meeting with Ehrlichman, Gray, and so on, explains that they have nothing whatever to do with the Watergate. They have nothing to do with this $100,000. They don't care who investigates the $100,000. It's not going to interfere with their business. So I guess it's either Ehrlichman or Haldeman who said yesterday, then they asked the CIA, is it possible that in the course of this investigation that something relating to the CIA might turn up? Can you give us an absolute guarantee that if we investigate this, we won't turn up some CIA operation? They say, of course we can't give you such a guarantee. Get that problem just giving people a parking ticket. They can't guarantee who's got overparked, whether it's one of their agents or not. So on that basis, the FBI is then called off the case because they might stumble on a CIA agent. Well, what does all this suggest? I think it clearly suggests the national security issue from Nixon 1969 to Nixon 1973 is bogus. But not just as bogus for the last 4 years, but I think we now have to consider maybe it's bogus for the last 25 years, ever since they started all this. That maybe last time I was talking, discussing the possibility it goes from Dallas to the Watergate, but maybe it goes from the Pumpkin Papers to the Watergate. One may have noticed that during the debacle at the end of the Pentagon Papers case here, that some of the testimony of Hunt was given to the court in Los Angeles, some of his grand jury testimony. In that grand jury testimony, Hunt explained how he made the fake cables that Kennedy is supposed to have sent ordering the assassination of Diem in 1963. And Hunt said that when he set to work on the cables, he couldn't find the typewriter on which the cables were originally written. But, he said, since the Alger Hiss case, nobody takes typewriter evidence seriously. So it didn't matter, and then proceeded without the real typewriter to make his forgeries. I noticed a couple of days ago Nixon said that one reason he couldn't trust the CIA's answer, that they had nothing to do with the Watergate, is that you can't rely on your subordinates, that that's what Truman did in the Hiss case. So Nixon has the Hiss case on his mind all the time as to where this all starts. The Hiss case, there are plenty of indications as false data. And after Hiss's second trial, experts from the Fogg Museum in Boston went over the typewriter evidence, issued a report saying that the typewriter alleged to be Alger Hiss's typewriter is a handmade typewriter in which the fonts were soldered by hand, that it's a sort of typewriter you couldn't buy, that it isn't Mr. Hiss's typewriter, that the documents presented in the Hiss trial were not typed in the order that they're chronologically dated, and one expert said that documents were not from 1938 but were from 1948. All this appears in the appendix in Alger Hiss's book on the case. At the time, the court refused to reopen the case on the basis of this evidence. I think after what Hunt said, and Hunt also casually remarks in the grand jury testimony when he was asked to fabricate the cables, it was no great difficulty for him because he'd been trained to do this, and he'd done it successfully many times. And I hope when he appears before the Irvin Committee, somebody starts asking him about these many times. But if this sort of forgery has been going on by the government, how do we know it didn't start with the Pumpkin Papers and the whole demolishment of a liberal State Department, the whole construction of the Cold War, isn't the outgrowth of this sort of thing. This is followed in rapid-fire succession by the Rosenberg case, by McCarthyism, completely eliminating a whole liberal past that had grown up under Franklin Roosevelt. Then in the 60s, we find a whole series of political assassinations which have changed the whole nature of our country. Each one of these assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the attempted assassination of Wallace were immediately covered up. Strangest documents are classified top secret, like Oswald's 1962 tax return, like the autopsy of Robert Kennedy. All this is being hidden, claimed to be classified in the interest of national security. Now that we know what national security amounts to under Nixon, and we've been told that the FBI was doing the sort of things Nixon wanted to reinstitute in 1970, was doing these from 1941 to 66, I think it's time to get extremely suspicious and to demand that we find out what's really been going on in this country and who's actually been running it. To come to the end of the story for the time being, what are we going to do with the present state of affairs? I think the present state of affairs, I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, has reached crisis proportions. That Nixon's government is a shambles, is unable to function anymore, that he is crippled as a president and won't be trusted by his party or by Congress for the rest of his term. When the 1970 paper purloined by Dean is published in a week or so, it's going to show that he ordered the commission of felonies, the violation of laws, the violation of the Constitution, the violation of his oath of office. What's going to follow then? Nixon, I think, gave his last defense in this crazy 4,000-word statement, and there's nothing left to do. The independent prosecutor, Mr. Cox, first day in the job, gets informed he's not an independent prosecutor. He's now supposed to take orders from Nixon. Nixon can't even remember from day to day what the state of affairs is. Congress is faced with an extremely serious problem if the government can't function and they're going to have undoubted proof the president has committed crimes. Agnew at the moment is functioning as impeachment insurance. He used to function as assassination insurance because no one lone nut, at least the suspicion is there's no nut lone enough who prefers Agnew as president to the present state of affairs. And now Congress, I think, feels somewhat stymied that if they impeach, the result is fairly obvious. And Nixon said to the POW, said to his family, he's not going to quit. And nobody's taken up Congressman Royce's plan that Nixon and Agnew both quietly resign, and we proceed from there. This being the state of affairs, I'm starting a suit to annul the election on the grounds of fraud, deceit, and so on, and I think the report by Charles Taft gives adequate grounds, and this is no joke. The suit is being discussed now in Massachusetts, New York, Missouri, Nevada, and California, and Judge Ruffin of San Diego is preparing a suit for me, and others preparing it in other states, and I think that this is our best way out. We know the last election was a fake. We know we didn't have a genuine democratic election, and now's the time, instead of moving forward into the impeachment problem, moving backward to hold a genuine election, and then start getting down to our problems again. Well, the question is whether we have any faith that I assume you're talking about the Irwin Committee, whether the Irwin Committee is really going to unearth all this, and the Speaker doesn't have much faith in the Democratic Party, thinks they're unlikely to really get to the bottom of it. Well, my guess is the bottom may be extremely deep, and Mr. Dean said in an interview in Time magazine last week, they've moved a couple of inches, but they have several miles to go. And I think he knows whereof he speaks. But I think one's also seeing a real crisis in the establishment, that they never realized that the mafia politics had taken over, and that what they assumed was a sort of game that they play between the Democratic and Republican Party according to certain rules has been burst wide open by Nixon and his crew. And Nixon's crew has made the Democratic Party the enemy and the Republican establishment unwanted. So that the Republican establishment can't talk to Nixon. There's an article in the San Diego paper yesterday that Bob Wilson, the head of the Congressional Committee of the Republicans, can't get a hold of Nixon on the phone. Hasn't been able to for months because Haldeman hates him. So I think the establishment wants to get rid of a feature of this. At the same time, they're so astounded by what's being used here that at least some members of it I've talked to in the last couple of weeks are prepared for the first time in a decade to consider that something outrageous has been going on for a hell of a long time, and that if this sort of conspiracy can be run in the last couple of years out of the White House, that maybe something like it's been run for the last decade. So I think people who would never have entertained the possibility that a conspiracy of the sort that appears in executive action could actually be taking place in this country now conceive it's a perfectly plausible set of events, because the same damn things happened the last couple of years. So I think there will be pressure to get much further than they have in the past.
I'd just like to say a word to that. You know, it's traditional in the American political scene that when there is extremism on the right, it is conservative forces which have dismantled it. That was true after the Palmer raids. It was true in the McCarthy period when Joseph Welch, the acerbic Republican from Boston, and the Watkins Committee took apart the McCarthy power base and brought censorship to the Congress, and is now it's Judge Sirica and the conservative constitutionalist Senator Ervin. That's been the history in this country, that the swing away from right extremism has come from the center in this country and never from the left. And I think that that's what we have to face now, and when we look forward now, perhaps to teach-ins on the campuses the way there were on the war, and in churches and in labor unions and town hall meetings, that there be, for the first time in American history, a radical critique and plan of action come forward out of this, and that we not simply rest, as the gentleman suggests, in the benign expectations of the Democratic Party to do the work for us. We have to not just be spectators at this television spectacular, but take a lucid and audacious series of actions, of which an overflow meeting like tonight is a good example. The ties to Dallas at this point, I think, are basically structural. That is, organized crime, certain kind of industry, especially aerospace and conglomerate industry, and intelligence fronts. Those ties exist. This is the paradigm or the model that we see here for Dallas. As far as actual personnel that's tied between Gemstone and the executive action of Dallas in 1963. Of course, that's very difficult, and it's going to take a lucky break, really, to break through. But let us say that one of those arrested in the Watergate, a man named Frank Sturgis, a professional assassin, was a friend, a colleague, a co-worker of both Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's New Orleans control or agent handler, and who had been working with him since he had been a teenager, as a matter of fact. And Sturgis was questioned by the FBI immediately after the Dallas assassination. It was left ambiguous, as are most things in the Warren Report, but he does seem to be a link, and he is involved in executive actions outside of the country. That much we know for sure.
What evidence is there linking Sturgis? Sturgis was arrested the day after, he was interrogated the day after, on November 23rd. there now are something like 60 pages of interviews with Sturgis from the FBI that are available, which don't hang together with what else we know. Sturgis apparently knew Oswald in 1962 in Miami. There's no evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who was killed in Dallas, ever was in Miami. So Sturgis may have known somebody else using that name, and in my book I offer evidence there's at least one other character, and I think by now we know of two other people who use that name. So Sturgis may have known somebody else using that name in some of these operations. Sturgis was involved in executive actions, was partly in Barker's speech in behalf of Sturgis the other day on the TV. What a great man he was. He started rattling off his past activities. But I think when Sturgis testifies, we're going to find that he has been engaged in a lot of CIA activities trying to change the governments in Latin American countries. The question is, why are some of the witnesses now speaking? Because they have immunity, nothing more can happen to them, and they hope, in the case of McCord, he hasn't been sentenced yet, he's hoping to influence his sentence. In the case of others, the sentence can be reduced. Now, Hunt and Sturgis have enormous sentences at the moment, but they've been given immunity for any other crime they want to discuss. So I understand Hunt and Sturgis have been telling the grand jury tons of things of what else they did for a living, and they can't be prosecuted for any other crime. So I think it's the present pressure that a lot of these people are not interested in spending the rest of their life in jail.
And I think besides that, we see here what's called, clearly a contradiction in the ruling circle. The CIA is fighting for its life, as is the FBI. And it's clear that McCord and others that are going to go down the line to protect the CIA, and the only way they can protect the CIA is to implicate fatally the White House, so that if this were happening in another country where you saw the attempted takeover of intelligence agencies and then an open rebellion between and among the intelligence agencies and the executive, you would realize that you were dealing with an aborted coup and with a government enmeshed in the hysteria and stranglehold of an aborted coup.
You may be taken in by the political way in which this thing is developing, that if the Democrats start screaming, then they build up a opposition in the Republican Party that would hamstring it. And I think, I'm not privy to what the Democratic Party's counsels are, but it appears to me that they are playing a very careful game of letting the conservative Democrats and the Republicans blow the thing wide open and not doing any pushing their own. They don't have to. But I think another one of your points is very serious as to whether, as this unfolds and becomes obvious that Democrats are a peripheral target and that the real paranoia of the government was about the counterculture, whether the Democrats are going to care that much about the controls that were introduced for the counterculture and going to let the thing peter out when it gets to that point. But I think the horror that everybody has read the Purloined document has expressed indicates that it does go beyond anything they'd ever conceive of doing.
I think these points are well taken, and it is a fight within a fight. That is to say, the Rockefeller agent Haig is in the White House now, the moderate wing of the Republican Party, while the right wing of the Republican Party is moving swiftly to take over the funding and the state and city machinery of the GOP machine. So there's a terrific fight going on. I would guess that we could say power has already changed hands, in my opinion. The fact that the independent prosecutor could only be a Kennedy man is a clear indication to me that the Kennedy elements of the establishment, of the ruling circle, are definitely coming into power at that level. That isn't to say the popular level, but at the level of the machinery of government and the backing of those elements in the establishment which can be considered progressive as opposed to the more reactionary elements that lie behind Operation Gemstone. I do think that in the teach-ins that I contemplate coming up, that it's time for a revision and a demystification of the Cold War in the 50s as never before, and that the Hiss case and the Rosenberg case have to be shown now. We can now point, we've been able to point all along to forgeries and subornation and every other kind of blackmail used in those cases. Now we have a different kind of context, a different kind of spotlight, and we owe it to the 1950s and what was they perpetrated war on the progressive movements in this country. They used the techniques of war while we used the techniques of the First Amendment. We used leaflets, we used the right to free speech, the right to demonstrate peacefully, we used the electoral process, we used political process to try to make change. It's clear now that we suffered and underwent a series of warlike actions against us. That explains our defeats in the 50s. It explains what happened to the black liberation movement in the 60s. They were the victims of warlike acts. That explains our defeats, not some subjective and psychological and hypercritical technique that we've developed to blame each other for our defeats. We suffered at the hands of a paramilitary orchestrated operation that's been in high gear for some 25 years. Having seen that, we have to come back now with the political techniques that we have developed in these periods and do what we did for Watergate, what we did in the war. We were able to create in the anti-war movement so much contradiction that Operation Watergate became inevitable for the ruling circle. And that's our next challenge in the 70s now.
I think one of the great opportunities we're going to have, whether we do it or whether the establishment does it, is for the first time we're going to find out how they carried on this paramilitary war. That people are now coming up from the underground, the FBI, the Secret Service, and so on, and the CIA, who are willing to explain how certain events occurred. And for the first time, we'll get the data and then be able to construct a real history of what went on. Question was whether, in view of what's come out about the difficulties the present administration had with J. Edgar Hoover and the opportune time of his death, whether there's any reason to suspect, I don't know whether you're suggesting foul play. I just don't know of any reason. He was an elderly gentleman, not in good health. So, what was he, 76? So I don't find it extraordinary. But it is, the month of May 1972 does turn out to have been a very extraordinary month. Hoover died at the beginning of it. Bremer shot Wallace in the middle of it, and the Watergate occurred. And isn't it also the month of one of the great busts in Washington, D.C.?
The Roundup.
I think they weren't reluctant. A lot of people of various political persuasions, as you know, jumped in as critics of the Warren Commission, and I think a majority of them were on the left. They were stymied by the establishment, which just put everything under lock and key, got all the public relations men to announce that everything's been explained. It's either too simple, so we don't have to explain it to you again, or it's too secret, we can't tell you about it.
I'm talking about the organized left itself, why they didn't pick it up.
It's also during the period the organized left is being subjected to this constant harassment on every front.
I have something to say about that. Asking the question is Jack Kimbrough, who's done a remarkable book on the RFK assassination, showing incontrovertible ballistics proof of 2 guns firing at the Ambassador Hotel in 1968. But this question I try to take up in detail in the novel of fact, Executive Action. One of the reasons the left did not respond to a crisis in 1963, certainly the equivalent of Watergate in 1973, was that the scenario, the cover-up scenario, worked. But the question is well taken, and in these teach-ins, I think the left should examine why it is that it accepted these crucial assassinations, accepted the story put out by the government propaganda, and did not address itself to these issues which affected the man in the street and the woman in the street in the 60s in the way that the war affected the radicals. I'll take this occasion now to make a revelation for the first time in public concerning the Kennedy assassination, and that is that both Professor Popkin and I on separate occasions, well, I'll speak only for myself, have now had confirmed that Mr. Clay Shaw was not a contract agent but an employee of the Central Intelligence Agency, and that comes from the highest-ranking Central Intelligence Agency officer ever to quit, Victor Marchetti. The super-conspirator, Charles Colson, is the go-between between the Teamsters and the White House.
He's the Teamsters lawyer right now.
Yeah, he's also the Teamsters lawyer. He took that account with him when he left the White House early, after having covered his tracks, as he thought perfectly, to set up Ehrlichman, Haldeman, Mitchell, and Dean and not get caught himself. And it's dubious to me whether Colson, who to me is the arch-conspirator, ever will be caught. And the reason I call Colson a double agent is that Colson does not come to the White House from the USC Old Boy gang or from UCLA or from the West Coast. Colson comes from being the chief aide to Carl McIntyre, the man in charge for orchestrating the pro-war marches, and the link between McIntyre and the American mission in Saigon and Marshal Key. And when he left the right, and these are the extreme elements of the right, the American Security Council, these are the elements involved, the action elements in these assassinations. When he went to the White House, the euphemism was used that he was to be liaison for the committee to re-elect, that is, to ethnic groups, the American Legion, and so forth. What he was liaison to was the extreme right, those same men from the American Security Council and the National Rifle Association, etc., who alone met with Nixon on the eve of the invasion of Cambodia.
Let me add, the Teamsters are a special problem. They've been involved with Nixon for a long time. They paid for his house in Palos Verdes estate. And I'm sorry Peter Scott isn't here tonight because he's an expert on all the dealings with him. A big suit is now going on between Chotiner and the man from New Hampshire, Leader Loeb, over Chotner's role in collecting $2.5 million or $3 million to get Hoffa out of jail, and the Teamsters' contribution to the re-election fund. So I think the Teamsters are a special element in their relations with Nixon. But with regard to Colson, besides what Don says, I had noticed that Colson's the one who brought Hunt into the whole operation and been looking for how he happened to know Hunt. That Hunt isn't the sort of man you meet casually. He's always off on a job. Turns out Colson went to college with Hunt in Brown in 1942, and they've been friends ever since. Hunt is also the extreme right. And when I met somebody who had been with Hunt the day Nixon went to China, and Hunt was raving, we shouldn't send people to China, we should send bombs to China. And here is Nixon's best agent, best burglar, and he doesn't even support the China policy.
By the way, both Colson and Hunt were two of the original organizers of Young Americans for Freedom, a definite intelligence front. And that Young Americans for Freedom will start to figure prominently now, I think, as we go further into Operation Gemstone, along with Viva.
The only other person who surfaced as a friend of Hunt's is William Buckley. And Buckley is the godfather of Hunt's 4 children and the executor of Mrs. Hunt's estate.
In the novel Executive Action exists what I consider the proof that Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, came to the decision that capital and the establishment could only be saved by the dismantling of CIA clandestine, which had gotten out of control. The Cuban desk and elements in the CIA were out of control, and that he must liquidate the involvement in Vietnam. Now, you can argue, as some do, and there's 2 arguments. One, that it was a steady, smooth escalation from Eisenhower through Nixon, or that Kennedy was making a change, and that was one of the reasons he was assassinated. I think there's proof for the second for this reason. When the headlines in 1963, October, blazoned, "Troops home by Christmas, advisors home by 65, and he put those words in the mouth of McNamara and Taylor. You can argue, well, he was just lying, like Johnson and Nixon. But there's one flaw in that argument. One thing that nobody ever did, except Kennedy, was set a date. To set a date was to take away the option for a political realist like the Kennedy brothers of going back on that option. In other words, he made this over a year before the election. He was bringing 1,000 troops a month home. He was down to 12,000. And Dick Popkin and I sat in the Pentagon Papers trial, and our mouth fell open when we heard read from the Pentagon Papers that the National Security Council minutes of August, September, and October 1963 and November are missing, and the historian of the Pentagon Papers in a footnote says, therefore, we have to rely on books that were published about the period. And it was precisely that gap or lacunae of August, September, October, November 63, when the decision was taken to liquidate Vietnam, when we only have the quote from Bobby Kennedy, we have to go all the way or get out. The same thing he used on the Hawks in the Bay of Pigs crisis, and we know was a technique of the Kennedy brothers to force the hand of the Hawks, to tell them to go all the way or get out. That's all we have left over from that 4-month period. It was into that gap that Charles Colson had Howard Hunt forge the cables. Because that gap existed, that those cables had been missing since just after the assassination, and it's into that gap that the forged cables to tie JFK to the DM assassination went. So I think that we have proof now that Kennedy, for reasons having nothing to do with pity for the Indo-Chinese people or a change of heart, decided, just as Nixon decided many years later to go to China to do many things, the SALT talks, disarmament, many things that Kennedy was planning. It's simply that Kennedy, almost a generation earlier, had taken the decision that he would build a new kind of coalition of labor, minorities, young people, and institute a kind of American quasi-social democracy and set up a reign which would lead from John Kennedy to Robert Kennedy to Edward Kennedy, stretching to 1984, a 24-year reign of power and an enormous restructuring of America. So that I'm not minimizing the power potential of the Kennedy brothers. What I'm saying is that I believe all evidence points that when those headlines came out, troops home by Christmas, advisors out by 65, that it was true.
Let me add a couple of facts I know on this. In the Washington Post of last Saturday, they print a story about the real secret intelligence organization that runs everything, which keeps changing its name anytime anybody finds out what its name is. And it keeps no records, but they decide what sort of executive actions will take place and so on. And the story says that Bobby Kennedy was never allowed to be a member of this group. He wanted very much to be, but Mitchell did become a member, and it got politicized as soon as Mitchell got involved. Kennedy was trying to get in charge of this sort of thing and was failing. All through 1963, he'd been setting up committees to find out what was really going on and who was running the intelligence organizations. And every time these committees would turn out to have either Allen Dulles on it or McCone or somebody else in the CIA, and Kennedy would be no further along than he was before. The last committee he appointed was in the early November 1973, and Allen Dulles was on it. It came to no useful conclusion by the time of his death. But I was told by Senator Morse that Morse, in a conversation with Bobby Kennedy right after the assassination, was assured that his brother had taken the decision to get out of Vietnam and was going to meet with Senator Lodge, who was then our consul in Saigon, 2 days later in San Francisco. So there seems to be a basis for the claim that it was really going to happen. As far as the Bay of Pigs goes, I don't know when it got started, but it's obviously well underway before Kennedy got to be president. Both Nixon said he knew all about it during the debates that were going on and didn't dare reveal it.
These are the best. When we say they're the best, Hunt was in charge of plans. The legendary Eduardo for Playa Girón, for the Bay of Pigs. And McCord was a super agent. Dulles dropped him behind the lines in the Soviet Union in the 1950s on the most delicate operations. But what must be pointed out, and I go to some pains to do it in the novel, they made even more egregious errors in the Dallas assassination of 1963. But the media and the electorate and the left were paralyzed and did not seize upon these errors. And when you say they are just bunglers, they are the best that American technology and finance can put forward. And to give proof of that, Until the day of their arrest, Hunt and McCord both sat on special emergency crisis committees. McCord was the head of a 16-man unit working out of the Pentagon in charge of the censorship of news and the roundup of subversives, and that's a quote, in time of emergency. And Hunt, in the 50s and 60s, had sat on 2 emergency planning boards in charge of censorship of news and roundup of subversives in time of emergency. These are the men who would act out, if necessary, the scenario after the agents provocateurs did their work in San Diego or Miami had Operation Gemstone not been aborted. But this is the best they can do, and they were equally clumsy in the Hiss case and in the Rosenberg case. A fool or a child can see what went on in the Rosenberg case. It's fear and not lack of their mistakes or our intelligence that have paralyzed us. And I think we have to say that just as they failed abominably in Vietnam with their plans, failed in Cuba, have failed all over the world and will fail all over the world because their worldview is based on an inferior race and an inferior class, starting with the American populace, that is doomed to failure, and that is why they have to resort everywhere and always to violence as soon as their crackpot scenarios break down. And that's why we have to push them to the wall now. They are moral morons, and operationally they are often fools and clowns. But what they have behind them is the organized violence of the state, and that we mustn't underestimate. But we mustn't overestimate the mystique of these clandestine crackpots.
I don't know whether it's arrogance or whether, as some people are suggesting, that maybe they were set up to fail, and they were setting themselves up to fail as part of their CIA war against the Nixon administration, because the whole thing, the actual Watergate, seems a really incredible burglary, and New York, Los Angeles, and all sorts of places are full of much better burglars than that.
There is a new book out in France identifying 2 of the Watergate men as having approached the OAS, that is the right-wing insurgents against de Gaulle, to kill Kennedy when he visited de Gaulle in 1962, using as a cover an attempted assassination on de Gaulle. And we don't have enough facts on that yet, but 2 of the Watergate have been, I think we can guess definitely who one of them is, but have been identified in France by an OAS agent.
I found, I was in Washington earlier part of May, that there's a tremendous struggle going on within the old agency, the CIA, between its original faction that set it up, between the young Turks who've been trying to get out the people they regard as dinosaurs like Hunt and McCord, and the politicized people who Nixon has brought in. The man who's been appointed new head of the CIA, hasn't been approved by Congress yet, was head of their political assassination division, Mr. Colby. And Mr. Colby has said in testimony before Congress he's responsible for Operation Phoenix, that he killed 6,000 political people in Vietnam by assassination, not by B-52s. So that's the sort of person who is the old CIA. And Colby, in an interview with the New York Times, said that he regards the CIA as the most important bulwark of democracy. It's more important than the political government, and so on. I talked to McCord when I was in Washington, and I think McCord holds similar views. And these represent the original CIA position. But then there are people who have come up since the original group who regard themselves more as technicians and see Hunt, McCord, Colby, and so on as Neanderthals from the original Cold War. And then Nixon's been adding into this politicized people who see the CIA as functioning as an arm of the political process of the ruling government. So I think at the moment there's a 3-cornered fight going on as to who's going to control the CIA and also what role it's going to play in the future. And McCord's been issuing endless memoranda. As you gather from the hearings, he writes them 6 times a day. And one day, as in Washington, he issued a 383-page memorandum. And each one of these things always ends with a plea for restoring the original CIA. So I think the old boys are trying to get back to where they were at 1950 or so, and with the sort of influence they have. The question is asked is, who are Sirhan and James Earl Ray, and how they fit into this pattern of conspiracy? Ray, I think, is a very interesting case where the evidence that he was guilty is so minimal, the evidence he's involved in conspiratorial activity maximal, and nobody, the establishment immediately decided he's a lone nut, he's a racist, and that's why he did it. They couldn't find anybody who ever discussed racism with him. He had lived in Los Angeles in a hotel somewhere around here, and nobody in the hotel ever heard him having the slightest interest in politics, race, or anything else. He apparently is a hired gun, a hired hoodlum who was smuggling from the time he escaped from jail to the time he was arrested after King's death. And smuggling is not an activity you can carry on by yourself. So you have to smuggle in concert. It's not one of these victimless crimes. It has to be a conspiracy. Mr. Fensterwald, who is McCord's lawyer, is also James Earl Ray's lawyer, and he's taken on the case after everybody else milked Ray of all the money he had, and he apparently had a hell of a lot in the beginning, far more than he could ever have gained by any of the activities the FBI claimed he was engaged in. The FBI said he earned his money bank robbing, but they could never name a bank he robbed. So Ray seems to have been somebody who was hired by a conspiratorial apparatus, which, from the fact he's engaged in smuggling, I guess it's connected with the mafia, and was sent from place to place to do various things. And Ray's own claim is he didn't do the shooting. He was just sent to register in a motel there, register in this rooming house, deliver a gun. Then, for the first time, since he never read anything but the sports section, he discovered when the gun went off that Martin Luther King was there and beat the hell out of the town, and then spent a fortune traveling around until he was caught. So I think Ray is part of a conspiratorial apparatus, and how it's connected with the others, I don't think we know yet. Sirhan's more mysterious. Maybe Mr. Kimbrough knows more about this, but there's certainly plenty of evidence that Sirhan did not act alone. The three people went with him to buy the bullets. There was the lady in the polka dot dress. There's some evidence that he was in San Diego with a man the day before getting ready for the event. So I think he's hardly a loner. Fensterwald has found, when he tried to get information from the State Department as to whether Sirhan ever had a passport, they clam up entirely, regarded as one of the greatest state secrets of all time. And Fensterwald used to be a lawyer for the State Department, has been able to find out about anybody else he is interested in, if they ever had a passport. But this is the one case where he's been absolutely stymied. So I think there is some indication that Sirhan's also part of some sort of conspiratorial apparatus. I have with me a motion that Fensterwald's made in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee, a memorandum of facts about the Ray case, which would convince any reasonable man they didn't solve the case. He's unable to get any evidentiary hearing, just gets turned down these things. So I'm going to try and publish this as an article, so at least if the courts don't want to hear it, people will know that there really is no case against Mr. Ray.
Great.